Brett Mercer's hand connected with the stranger's face, before most people on the boardwalk even registered what was happening. The crack of it cut through the afternoon noise, through the creak of wagon wheels and the dull thud of boots on dry wood, and landed like a stone dropped into still water. Every conversation within 30 feet stopped. A woman near the general store pressed her hand over her mouth. Two men standing outside the barber shop took a single step backward, as if distance might protect them from whatever came next. Brett was already laughing. He stood with his thumb hooked in his belt and his hat pushed back on his head, performing for the small crowd the way a man performs when he's never once had to worry about consequences. His two hired men, Cole Maddox on his left, a thicker man named Dex on his right, watched with the flat, patient expressions of people who'd seen this particular show before and knew their role in it. The stranger didn't fall, didn't stumble. He just stood there with his weight distributed evenly between both feet, his hands loose at his sides, and slowly raised one hand to touch the red mark forming on his left cheek. Then he looked at Brett Mercer, not with fury, not with fear, with something quieter and far more unsettling, the expression of a man who has just learned something important about the person standing in front of him and is filing it away for later use. "You only get to do that once," he said. His voice was level, not soft, not loud, just steady in the way that a plumb line is steady, not dramatic, just true. Brett laughed louder. Maddox smiled. Dex shifted his weight and scanned the crowd to make sure everyone was watching. If you had been standing on that boardwalk in Red Hollow, Wyoming territory on that particular October afternoon in 1884, you might have assumed it was over. Another stranger, another lesson, another man who'd move on down the road by morning and thank whatever luck he had that he got away with only a bruise. You would have been wrong. What happened in Red Hollow in the 3 days following that slap was not the story of a drifter picking a fight with a bully. It was the story of how a man who refused to be humiliated into silence dismantled 6 years of corruption so carefully constructed that an entire town had stopped believing it could ever come apart. Before we go any further, if you've never visited this channel before, I'd ask you to subscribe and stay through to the end, because this story goes places you won't expect. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one. I want to know how far these stories travel. And if this one pulls at something in you, hit the like button. It helps more people find it. Now, back to Red Hollow. The town itself was the kind of place that looked ordinary from a distance and revealed its damage only slowly, the way a cracked foundation reveals itself not all at once but in the gradual settling of doors that no longer close quite right. Red Hollow had one main street wide enough for two wagons to pass each other without trouble, a saloon called the Powderhorn that did its busiest business on Fridays and Saturdays, a general store run by a small, careful man named Garrett Finch, who had learned years ago to keep his opinions to himself, a livery stable, a marshal's office, and perhaps 60 or 70 structures of varying quality spreading out from the main road in the way that settlements grow, when people arrive faster than planning can keep up with them. It sat in a shallow valley with good grass and reliable water from a creek that ran along the eastern edge of the valley floor. That creek and that grass were the reason cattle country had taken root here, and cattle country was the reason Harlan Mercer mattered. Harlan had arrived in the valley 17 years earlier with enough money to buy land, enough patience to wait out the dry years, and enough ruthlessness to absorb smaller operations when their owners ran short of either. By 1878, 6 years before the afternoon, Brett slapped a stranger on the boardwalk. Harlan Mercer controlled the largest single cattle operation within 2 days' ride of Red Hollow, employed 14 men directly, and had cultivated relationships with enough county officials to ensure that when disputes arose, they arose in his favor. That was the polished version of the story. The version Harlan told at county meetings and cattle association dinners, told with a calm authority that invited no interruption. The other version was not told at dinners. The other version involved a series of smaller ranchers who had sold out to Harlan under pressure that never quite crossed the line into anything a marshal could act on. A water diversion here, a fence line mysteriously moved there, cattle that disappeared from smaller herds in numbers too precise to be coyotes, but never quite large enough to force a formal investigation. The other version involved Marshal Warren Pike, who had been taking an envelope of cash from the Mercer operation every month for 4 years, and who had developed, in that time, an extraordinary ability to find legal technicalities wherever a complaint against the Mercers was concerned. The other version was what Red Hollow actually ran on. Brett Mercer was 26 years old and had grown up inside that version, had grown up watching his father solve problems with money and watching money solve problems that looked unsolvable, had grown up with Cole Maddox and men like him as a kind of permanent audience, Men who laughed when Brett laughed, and stepped back when Brett wanted space and made sure the world arranged itself around his preferences. It had given him a particular kind of confidence that had no floor under it, confidence that had never once been tested, and so had no idea what testing felt like. Elias Rourke had arrived in Red Hollow 3 days before the slap, riding a lean gray mare that looked like it had covered significant ground. He'd taken a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Clara Tatum, paid a week in advance without being asked, eaten his meals at the smaller of the 2 eating establishments on the main street, and spent his time observing Red Hollow with the quiet thoroughness of a man who'd learned that watching carefully was more useful than moving quickly. Nobody knew what he did for a living. He didn't volunteer it. He was somewhere in his late 30s, lean in the way that men get lean when they've worked outdoors for years rather than the way they get lean from deprivation. He wore a revolver on his hip the way working men wore tools not displayed, not hidden, just present. He had the kind of face that was easy to underestimate, not remarkable enough to stick in the memory on first look, but carrying, if you paid attention, a quality of attention itself, the sense that behind the unremarkable exterior, something was turning over and cataloging everything it saw. He'd been watching Brett Mercer for 2 of those 3 days before the confrontation on the boardwalk. He'd watched Brett walk into Garrett Finch's general store and handle goods he had no intention of buying, setting them back down in the wrong places, watching Finch's face as the man calculated whether saying anything would cost him more than absorbing the disruption. He'd watched Brett and Maddox ride their horses deliberately close to a pair of children crossing the street, close enough to make the children run, Brett looking back over his shoulder with the satisfied expression of a man who finds other people's fear amusing. He'd watched Brett publicly dress down a ranch hand who'd made some minor error, standing over the man in front of 3 witnesses while the ranch hand stared at the ground with the particular stillnesses of someone who had learned that any visible reaction makes it worse. Elias had watched all of this without expression, from different vantage points, saying nothing. Then the afternoon on the boardwalk arrived. Elias had been walking toward the powder horn with no particular agenda beyond the desire to sit somewhere out of the wind with a cup of coffee. Brett had been coming from the other direction with Maddox and Dex, taking up the full width of the boardwalk in that way that was designed to make the person approaching either step off into the street or wait like a supplicant. Elias had continued walking at his usual pace, keeping to his side, which left no room for Brett to pass without adjusting. Brett did not adjust. Brett stopped, planted himself, and waited for the stranger to drop his eyes and step aside. Elias stopped too, looked at Brett without hostility, without aggression, with the patient assessment of a man conducting an evaluation. That assessment apparently irritated Brett more than anger would have. "You got somewhere to be," Brett said. "Do you?" Elias replied. It was the wrong answer. Or, depending on your perspective, exactly the right one. Brett's hand came up fast, connected with Elias's cheek, and produced that crack that stopped every conversation within 30 feet. Then came the silence. Then came the statement, "You only get to do that once." Then came Brett's laughter, confident and dismissive, already moving on from the moment, because in his experience, moments like this ended in one of 2 ways. Either the stranger backed down, or the stranger made a move. And if he made a move, then Maddox and Dex made their move, and that was the end of strangers in Red Hollow. Elias did neither. He stood there for another 2 or 3 seconds, long enough to make the crowd uncomfortable with the stillness of it, and then he nodded once, a small private confirmation of something, and walked around Brett and continued toward the powder horn. Brett watched him go. The laughter faded. "Who is that?" he said, to no one in particular. Nobody on the boardwalk answered him. Elias sat at the far end of the powder horn's bar with a cup of coffee and pressed 2 fingers gently against his cheek. It wasn't bad. He'd had worse. What interested him was not the pain. Pain was information, and this particular information was not new, but what the incident had revealed about how Red Hollow actually worked. In most towns, what had just happened on the boardwalk would have produced some reaction. A marshal's appearing, someone pulling Brett aside and murmuring a word of caution, some social pressure that acknowledged what everyone had just witnessed. Instead, the crowd had dispersed with the practiced efficiency of people who had been trained by experience to make themselves scarce after Brett Mercer lost patience with someone. That told Elias something. He'd been in enough places like Red Hollow to recognize the specific texture of a town under the thumb. It wasn't always visible in any single thing. It was visible in the aggregate in the way people timed their movements to avoid contact with certain individuals, in the subjects that produced careful subject changes when raised in public, in the particular quality of quiet that fell over a room when the wrong person walked in. Red Hollow had all of it. The barkeep, a broad-shouldered man named Callum, who had probably learned to read rooms the way sailors learn to read weather, set about wiping down the bar near Elias with the studied nonchalance of someone who wanted to be nearby, and also did not want anyone to notice he wanted to be nearby. "You're still here," Callum said. "Appears so. Most men who come through after something like that, they decide their business was elsewhere." "I don't have business elsewhere," Elias said. Callum put down the cloth, looked at the far wall for a moment. "What's your business here, if you don't mind?" "I mind," Elias said pleasantly. "But I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't trouble. Not the kind you're worried about." Callum seemed to process this, picked the cloth back up. "Brett Mercer doesn't forget," he said, which was not quite a warning, and not quite information, more like a weather report, delivered by someone who couldn't control the weather but felt obligated to mention it. "I know," Elias said, "neither do I." He finished his coffee, left a coin on the bar, and walked out into the afternoon. The boarding house was quieter in the late afternoon, the other two current guests both away until evening. Mrs. Clara Tatum occupied in her kitchen with the sounds of supper preparation. Elias sat on the edge of his bed with his coat off and thought about what he knew. He'd come to Red Hollow because of a conversation he'd had 6 weeks earlier in a cattle town 3 days' ride northeast. A rancher named Simmons, a decent enough man who'd sold his operation the previous spring under circumstances that kept him up at night, had described a pattern that Elias recognized from other places. Too many small sellers, too many coincidences, a local law structure that somehow always resolved in the same direction. Brand discrepancies that were small enough to be chalked up to record-keeping errors when taken individually, and only became visible as a pattern when you stood far enough back to see all of them at once. Simmons had lost cattle he couldn't prove he'd lost, had sold land for less than it was worth, because by the time the offer came he'd been bled down to the point where the offer was the only reasonable option, and had spent the year since putting together a picture of where those cattle went, and who had benefited, a picture he couldn't present to anyone locally, because locally everyone who mattered had been either bought or frightened into useful blindness. Elias had listened to the whole thing, had asked the kinds of questions that narrowed down the location of the evidence rather than the identities of the criminals. He already had a reasonable sense of those, had spent a week verifying what he could verify from public records in the county seat, and had ridden to Red Hollow to see the rest of it with his own eyes. What he'd needed to know before moving was whether the brand records the secondary set that Simmons believed existed, the set that would show the actual movement of cattle rather than the official version, were still on the Mercer property and still intact. Everything else he could work around. Without those records, or without someone who could confirm their existence and location, the pattern he'd assembled was compelling but not actionable. A federal inspector would need something physical to work with, something that couldn't be explained away. He'd been 3 days into trying to find that confirmation when Brett Mercer slapped him on a public boardwalk, which was, in certain respects, useful information. A man who did that in public, in daylight, in front of witnesses, was a man who believed so completely in his own protection that he'd stopped calculating risk. That kind of certainty usually had a source, and a source could be interrupted. Elias lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and started working through what he needed, and in what order. The next morning he was up before full light, eating a breakfast, Mrs. Tatum left out for early risers bread, hard cheese, coffee from a pot that sat on the back of the stove, and thinking about Nolan Pierce. He'd noticed the young man 2 days earlier. Late teens, maybe 20, working the counter at Finch's general store, with the distracted, faintly miserable quality of someone occupying a position that fit him the way borrowed clothes fit. Not sullen, he was polite with customers. Efficient, knew where everything was but carrying something. Elias had seen that carrying quality before in people who'd been humiliated in public and hadn't found any way to set it down yet. He'd asked carefully and indirectly about the young man. The answer came back in pieces from different sources. Nolan Pierce, nephew of the woman who ran the laundry on the south end of the main street, had been working at Finch's store for 2 years after a previous job on a ranch east of town ended abruptly. The ending had something to do with Brett Mercer. Those specifics were the kind of thing people in Red Hollow tended not to offer without being specifically asked, and sometimes not even then. Elias finished his coffee and walked to the general store an hour after it opened, when the morning's first rush of customers had thinned out, and Finch himself had retreated to his back room, with the ledger he seemed to spend considerable time with. Nolan was behind the counter, restacking bolts of fabric that didn't particularly need restacking. Elias set 2 items on the counter, a tin of tobacco he didn't need, and a folding knife with a cracked handle that he'd noticed in the glass case, and which seemed like a plausible excuse to be there, and watched Nolan work the transaction with practiced movements of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "You were at the feeding station east of town," Elias said, as Nolan was making change. "Before you came here." Nolan's hand stopped. "East feeding station," Elias said, giving the man time to decide. For about 8 months, Nolan said finally. His voice was flat. 2 years ago. What happened? It wasn't a question exactly. It was an opening, and Nolan had to decide whether to walk through it or close it. He looked at Elias for a moment. Really looked, the assessing look of someone trying to determine whether the person in front of them is safe or is just performing safety. Brett Mercer happened, Nolan said. Like he happens to most things around here. Tell me. It took 20 minutes, with 2 interruptions for actual customers, and Nolan told it in the careful, compressed way of someone who's already organized the events in his memory, because he's been over them enough times to know exactly what they were. He'd been working the feeding station with 3 other men, one of whom was his cousin, a man named Walt. The station itself was contracted to winter feed cattle for several ranchers in the area, including that year a portion of the Mercer herd. Midway through the winter, Walt had noticed that the cattle counts didn't line up, that there were significantly more cattle in the east pasture than the feeding records accounted for, and that the brands on the additional animals included marks from at least 4 ranches that were not Mercer property. Walt had mentioned it to the station foreman, who had gone pale and told Walt to go back to work and forget what he'd said. Walt had been unable to forget it. He'd written down what he'd seen, brands, rough counts, dates in a letter to the Cattle Association, using his real name because he was 22 years old, and still believed that real names on complaints mattered. Within 2 weeks, Brett Mercer had appeared at the feeding station with Maddox and 3 other men. He had not been violent, not technically. He had simply informed the station foreman, in front of all 4 workers, that one of his employees had filed a false and malicious complaint against the Mercer operation, that this kind of behavior reflected poorly on the station's business judgment, and that he trusted the situation would be corrected. The foreman had fired all 4 men by the following morning. Walt had lost his job. Nolan, who had nothing to do with the letter, had lost his job beside him because he was Walt's cousin, and Brett Mercer understood the value of sending messages that were slightly larger than the offense required. Nolan had ended up at Finch's store because Finch cautiously, and without making a statement about it, had given work to 2 other people over the previous years who'd found themselves unemployed by Mercer displeasure. Finch had never said a word about it, had simply offered work. "Where's Walt now?" Elias said. "Still around. He took a job at the livery stable. Doesn't talk about what happened." Nolan looked at the counter surface. "Doesn't talk much about anything. Does he still have what he wrote down?" The question landed between them and sat there. Nolan raised his eyes. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because I need to know whether there's anything left of what your cousin found," Elias said. "And because I think you already know the answer, or you know how to find it. A woman came in for thread and a tin of baking powder. Nolan served her efficiently, made correct change, wished her a good morning. The door closed behind her. Walt kept a copy," Nolan said quietly. "Kept it because he thought, I don't know what he thought. That it would matter someday, it might," Elias said. "Why would it matter now?" "It didn't matter then." The association ignored the complaint. Marshal Pike came out and talked to the station foreman and wrote something in his notebook, and that was the end of it. Nolan's voice had an edge of old bitterness in it, the kind that's been worn smooth by time but hasn't disappeared. "They own everything here. You understand that? There's no part of this town that they don't have a hand in. Brand records," Elias said, "a secondary set, hidden somewhere on the Mercer property. Do you know anything about that?" This time the silence was different. Nolan was very still. "Where'd you hear that?" he said. "I'll answer your question after you answer mine." Nolan glanced toward the back room where Finch was working, looked at the door, looked at Elias. "Walt heard something," he said, "from a man who worked the Mercer ranch for a while before he moved on. Walt told me about it, but I don't know if it's real or just talk." "What did the man say?" said Harlan, kept a second ledger. "Said it was in the ranch house, in a room off the main hall that Harlan kept locked." Nolan's jaw tightened slightly. "Said the ledger had real brand records in it, where the cattle actually came from, not the official version." Elias said nothing for a moment. "Who is this man who worked the ranch?" he said. "He's gone. Moved on over a year ago." Walt said he left in a hurry. Nolan shook his head. "I don't know where." Elias nodded slowly. The piece about the locked room matched other information he'd gathered from other sources, information that had been partial and unverifiable until now. He had enough of an outline to work with. Not everything, not the location of the room within the house, not confirmation that the ledger was still there and hadn't been moved or destroyed, but enough. "Cousin," he said. "Would he talk to me?" Nolan looked at him steadily. "Why should he? You're a stranger who walked into this town and got slapped by Brett Mercer on a public street and didn't leave. That's either very brave or very stupid, and Walt's been through enough that he doesn't need more of either." "Fair," Elias said. "Tell him this. Tell him that a federal inspector named Calder is 3 days' ride from here, that I sent a letter before I came into town. and that I need Walt's copy of that original complaint to put with the other information I already have, not to start a fight to end one. Nolan studied him. You already sent the letter, he said. I sent it before I arrived. I wanted to see the place first. Make sure I had what I thought I had. Elias picked up the tobacco tin and the knife. Talk to Walt. Tell him what I told you. I'll be at the boarding house this evening if he wants to come. He left coins on the counter for both items and walked out. Walt Pierce came to the boarding house at 7:30 that evening, after dark, moving through the back alley between properties, the way people move when they've learned that being seen in the wrong company has costs. He was a quieter version of his cousin, a little older, a little more worn, with the particular wariness of someone who'd been burned by trust before and was making a careful decision about whether to try it again. He brought the letter. A single page folded many times, the paper soft from handling. He unfolded it on the small table in Alyssa's room and smoothed it flat with his palm. Elias read it. The information was incomplete in some places and precise in others. The precision was in the brands and the dates and the cattle numbers. The incompleteness was in the names, the locations, the chain of movement, but it corroborated the outline of what Elias had already assembled from other sources, and combined with those sources, it started to form something with shape and weight. You still want to do something with this, Elias said. Walt looked at his letter on the table. I've been wanting to do something with it for 2 years, he said. I just didn't know what something was. It's not going to be clean, Elias said. It's going to be loud before it's over, and there's going to be a window where the Mercers know something is happening and don't know what, and that's the most dangerous window. I need you to understand that. Walt nodded. And I need one more thing, Elias said. Someone inside the Mercer operation, or someone who's had contact with it recently. Someone who might know whether the second ledger is still in that room. There's a man, Walt said slowly. Works out at the ranch.
Name's Decker.
He came to the station once, couple years before everything happened, with a small complaint about a fence line that turned out to be nothing. He seemed decent. Not Mercer's man by nature, just by employment. Walt shook his head. I don't know if he'd talk. Can you find out without putting him at risk? Elias said. Maybe. I know where he drinks. I could. Walt stopped. This feels like I'm getting into something I don't know the shape of. You don't, Elias agreed. That's why I'm not asking you to do anything but find out whether that man would be willing to have a conversation. That's it. That's the whole ask for tonight. Walt looked at the letter on the table, picked it up, folded it back along its worn creases. Okay, he said. 2 mornings later, Elias sat on a bench outside the boarding house in the early cold, watching the main street wake up, when he heard Brett Mercer's voice carrying from the direction of the saloon. Brett was talking about the stranger who'd been stupid enough to stay. The words were loud enough to be designed to carry, which meant they were for Elias's ears as much as for whoever Brett was talking to. Man gets slapped and doesn't leave, Brett was saying. Either he's got business here that's going to turn out to be nobody's business, or he's just flat stupid. The second option was the one Brett clearly preferred to believe. Elias sat on the bench and watched a hawk circle, something in the field east of town, and thought about timing. Decker had talked to Walt, briefly and carefully, in the back corner of the powder horn the previous evening. Decker had confirmed, in the compressed and deniable way of someone who was not quite committing to anything, that the room Elias had heard about was real, and that the materials in it had not, as far as Decker knew, been moved. That was what Elias had been waiting for. The letter he'd sent before arriving in Red Hollow had been addressed to a federal inspector's circuit office. The inspector, a methodical and, from what Elias knew of him, incorruptible man who had worked cattle theft cases in the territory before operated on a rotation schedule that put him within reasonable riding distance of Red Hollow approximately now. The letter had laid out the outline of the case and had asked for 2 things, discretion and a reasonable expectation that Elias would have physical evidence ready when the inspector arrived, or close to ready. Elias had physical evidence. He had Walt's original complaint. He had his own compiled notes from conversations with former Mercer employees and affected ranchers over the previous 6 weeks. He had Decker's confirmation of the secondary record's existence. What he did not have was the secondary ledger itself, and he did not intend to go get it himself. He intended the inspector to do that with official authority, before Harlan Mercer had time to move it, which meant Elias needed to keep Brett's attention focused on the wrong problem for another 24 to 48 hours. He stood up from the bench and walked down the main street in the direction of Brett's voice. Brett was standing outside the powder horn with Maddox and 2 other men, and when he saw Elias approaching, he straightened slightly with the pleased anticipation of a man who's been hoping the problem would come to him so he wouldn't have to go looking. Still here, Brett said. Still here, Elias agreed. I'm starting to think you don't understand how things work in this town. Elias stopped at a conversational distance. I understand pretty well. Then you understand that men who make me have to think about them twice tend to have short stays. I understand that you believe that, Elias said. There was a fractional silence, not long, but enough for the men with Brett to exchange a glance. You got something you want to say, Brett said, and his voice had lost some of the performance in it, had dropped to something slightly more direct. Not yet, Elias said. I'll let you know when I do. He turned and walked back the way he'd come. He could feel Brett's eyes on his back, and he could feel Brett's frustration, which was a useful thing to be carrying. A frustrated man makes noise. A man who makes noise draws attention. And attention, at this particular moment, was exactly where Elias wanted it directed on him, on the visible surface of what appeared to be a personal conflict, and not on the quiet machinery turning over underneath it. 3 days after a man was slapped on a public boardwalk in Red Hollow, Wyoming territory, nobody in that town, not Brett Mercer, not Marshall Pike, not Harlan Mercer sitting in his ranch house 3 miles outside of town, counting his own certainty, understood yet that the slap had been the last easy moment any of them were going to have. Elias Rourke walked back to the boarding house, sat down at the small desk in his room, and began writing the final set of notes that he would hand to the federal inspector when he arrived. His cheek had stopped hurting. He hadn't thought about it since the first afternoon. The notes Elias had been writing when he stopped, late that first night, filled 3 pages in a hand that was small in preciseness, not the hand of a man who wrote often for pleasure, but of someone who had learned long ago that memory was unreliable under pressure, and that the only thing worth trusting was what you'd put on paper before things got complicated. He read them back in the gray light of early morning, the lamp already extinguished, and made 2 small corrections. Then he folded the pages into the inside pocket of his coat and went down to breakfast. Mrs. Tatum had made eggs and salt pork and set out the coffee without being asked, which was the kind of efficiency that came from 30 years of running a boarding house and reading guests the way experienced people read weather. She didn't ask him how he'd slept. She didn't ask him anything. She set down a plate and refilled his cup when it dropped below half, and left him alone with his thinking, which he was beginning to appreciate about her more than he could easily articulate. The town was just beginning to move outside. Wagon wheels on dry ground. Somebody's dog with strong opinions about something at the far end of the street. The faint sound of the livery stable waking up the particular restlessness of horses who knew the day was starting and wanted their say about it. Elias ate slowly and thought about Decker. The confirmation Decker had given Walt was useful, but it was also fragile in a specific way that Elias had learned to pay attention to. A man who confirmed something in the back corner of a saloon, speaking quietly and carefully, and technically not committing to anything, was a man who was still making his calculation. Decker wasn't Mercer's man by conviction. Walt had said that, and Elias had believed it, but that didn't make him available. It made him undecided. And undecided men, when they felt pressure from one direction, had a tendency to move towards the side that seemed more immediately dangerous, which meant the Mercers couldn't know about Decker. Not yet. Not until there was no longer anything the Mercers could do about it. The timing question was the one Elias kept returning to. The letter he'd sent to the inspector's circuit office had gone out 6 weeks ago, with a follow-up sent from the county seat before he'd ridden to Red Hollow. Inspector Calder's rotation schedule was not a secret. It was part of how the territory administered itself, published in the circuit court's quarterly notices, and Elias had built his timeline around it. By his calculation, Calder was now somewhere between 2 days and 3 days' ride to the northeast, depending on what cases had held him up along the way. 1 day of delay on that calculation and the window compressed dangerously. 2 days and the thing unraveled. He needed to send 1 more communication, something that would reach Calder on the road rather than at the circuit office, a rider heading northeast who could intercept the inspector's route and confirm that Red Hollow was ready and that the evidence existed and where it was. The problem was finding a rider he could trust with that errand, without the information spreading. Red Hollow was not a large town. Information moved through small towns the way water moved through sand, not in visible streams but pervasively, in directions you couldn't predict and often couldn't trace back. He finished breakfast, thanked Mrs. Tatum in the functional way she seemed to prefer over more elaborate expressions of appreciation, and went to find Walt Pierce. Walt was at the livery stable before the main business of the day had properly started, working a section of fence line along the stable's rear paddock with the focused, slightly hunched posture of a man who'd made peace with physical work after deciding that physical work was safer than any alternative. He was good at it. The movements were clean, nothing wasted, but Elias could see, even at distance, the way Walt periodically scanned the alley behind the stable with the peripheral vigilance of someone who'd been surprised before and not enjoyed it. Elias came in from the front, which gave Walt time to see him coming and decide not to be alarmed. "I need a rider," Elias said without preamble. because Walt seemed like a man who didn't require or want the social scaffolding of gradual approach. Someone who can take a message northeast and intercept a man on the circuit road. One day out, maybe a day and a half. Someone who doesn't talk. Walt set down the fencing tool. How fast do you need this? Today, if possible. Walt looked at the paddock fence. There's a boy, not a boy. He's 19, who does courier work for Finch's store sometimes. Carries orders to ranches that are too far out for daily delivery. Knows the roads northeast. He paused. His name's Aubrey. He's quiet by nature, not by instruction, which is the better kind. Does he know enough about the Mercers to be scared of them? Everybody in Red Hollow knows enough about the Mercers to be scared of them. Walt's voice was flat. Question is whether that fear makes him careful or makes him useless. Which is it for him? Careful, Walt said after a moment. He's cautious. He doesn't like trouble, but he doesn't run from things he thinks matter. He picked up the fencing tool again. I can ask him. I won't explain more than he needs to know. That's all I'm asking. Walt nodded, his attention already moving back to the fence line. Elias left him to it. The problem with Brett Mercer was not that he was dangerous in any sophisticated way. Problem was that he was dangerous in the simple, blunt, immediate way of someone who had never needed sophistication because raw power had always been sufficient. He didn't plan 3 steps ahead. He didn't need to. He identified an irritant and he removed it, using whatever force was available and convenient, and the consequences of that removal were managed by his father's money and Marshall Pike's creative record-keeping. That method worked perfectly well in most situations. It was in fact the correct method in most situations involving unwanted strangers in small towns. Elias had been banking on the fact that Brett would apply it reflexively, without stopping to ask whether this particular situation called for a different approach. He had been right about that. What he'd slightly miscalculated was how quickly Brett's patience would exhaust itself. He found out how quickly when Maddox appeared at the boarding house door that afternoon, while Elias was in his room reviewing his notes for the 4th time. Mrs. Tatum's knock on his door was different from her usual knock, slightly more tentative, which was not her natural mode, and so communicated exactly what it was meant to communicate. Man at the door, she said when Elias opened it. Says he has a message from Brett Mercer, she said. The name the way people in Red Hollow said it with a careful absence of tone that was itself a tone. Send him up, Elias said. I'd rather not have him upstairs, Mrs. Tatum said, with the matter-of-fact firmness of a woman who'd run her own establishment for 30 years and had definite opinions about what came into it. I'll come down, Elias said. Maddox was standing in the front hallway with his hat in his hand, the hat removal either genuine courtesy or a performance of it. Elias couldn't tell, and had the look of a man who'd been given a specific instruction and was now concentrating on delivering it accurately. Brett wants to talk, Maddox said. Tonight, Powderhorn. 8 o'clock. Elias looked at him. Brett want me to know what the subject is. I think he figures you know what the subject is. All right, Elias said. Tell him I'll be there. Maddox put his hat back on with the air of a man whose task is completed, nodded once to Mrs. Tatum in the general direction of courtesy, and left. Mrs. Tatum watched the door close behind him. That's Cole Maddox, she said. I know he's put 3 men in the dirt in the last 2 years. That's the ones people know about. I know that too, Elias said. She looked at him with the evaluating expression she'd probably applied to several decades worth of guess, the look of someone who has seen enough of what people actually are to trust her first read of them. You're not scared, she said. It wasn't admiring. It was more like a clinical observation. I'm appropriately concerned, Elias said. That's a careful answer. It's the honest one. She went back to her kitchen without further comment, which he took as a qualified endorsement. He spent the remaining afternoon hours making himself visible in the ways that mattered, walking the main street, at a pace that communicated he had nowhere urgent to be, stopping at Finch's store to buy a few small practical items, sitting briefly on the bench outside the boarding house reading nothing in particular. He was manufacturing a version of events for anyone watching, a man with no agenda, no urgency, comfortable in a place where he had no apparent reason to be comfortable. Meanwhile, underneath the visible surface of this performance, 3 things were in motion that Brett Mercer knew nothing about. Aubrey Walt's cautious 19-year-old courier had left Red Hollow before noon, riding northeast, with a sealed letter tucked inside his vest. The letter contained the most critical information, where Calder should go first when he reached Red Hollow, and why the ranch house mattered more than anything else in town. Elias had written it in a way that would mean something specific to Calder and nothing interpretable to anyone else who might read it. He had no guarantee Aubrey would find the inspector on the road. But the alternative, waiting and hoping Calder arrived on schedule with no confirmation that Red Hollow was ready, was worse. Walt had also, quietly and without fanfare, spent part of the afternoon speaking to a woman named Bessie Greer, who ran the laundry at the south end of the main street, and who had connections to half the working people in Red Hollow, in the way that people who handle everyone's clothing tend to develop connections. Bessie was not part of any plan, but she knew which of the town's residents had been most directly hurt by the Mercers, and Walt was quietly building a mental list of people who might be willing to come forward when the time came to come forward. This was not something Elias had asked Walt to do. Walt had started doing it on his own, which told Elias something useful about the nature of what it set in motion, that it had already begun to move under its own energy, and that the town's accumulated grievance was looking for a direction. The third thing in motion was the one Elias had least control over, which was Decker. He didn't know what Decker was deciding. He didn't know if the conversation at the Powderhorn had tipped Decker toward doing the right thing, or had frightened him back toward the safety of doing nothing. Decker was a variable he'd had to build into his plan as an uncertainty, and uncertain variables had a way of resolving themselves at the worst possible moment. At 7:30, he put on his coat and walked to the Powderhorn. The saloon at that hour was doing moderate business, 10 or 12 men distributed between the bar and the tables, 2 card games in progress, Callum working the bar with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. The noise level was the social kind rather than the celebratory kind, the sound of men at the end of working days rather than men looking for trouble. Brett was already there. He'd taken a table near the back wall rather than sitting at the bar, which suggested either that someone had advised him toward a more private setting or that he'd arrived at that judgment himself. Maddox was at the bar with a drink, positioned in a way that was probably meant to look casual, and landed closer to conspicuous. Dex was not visible, which made Elias note the back door as he moved through the room. He sat down across from Brett without waiting to be invited, because waiting to be invited was a posture of supplication, and he had no intention of establishing that dynamic this late in proceedings. Brett looked at him with the assessment of someone who'd been thinking about this conversation since he'd issued the invitation and had prepared what he believed was an effective approach. "You've been here 4 days," Brett said. 5, Elias said. Brett's jaw moved slightly. He didn't like being corrected on facts. 5 days. Haven't seen you meet with anyone important. Haven't seen you do business. Haven't seen you have any particular reason to be here. He paused. That bothers me. I know, Elias said. Men without visible reasons make me think their reasons aren't something they want visible. That's a reasonable inference, Elias said. Brett put both hands flat on the table. I'm going to ask you a straightforward question. I want a straightforward answer. Are you working for someone who has a problem with my family's operation? Elias considered him for a moment. No, he said. Brett's expression shifted, not quite satisfied, not quite convinced. Then what are you doing here, passing through? Elias said. Slower than usual, because of what happened on the boardwalk. Partly. You're still here because I slapped you. Brett said it with a complex of emotions that mixed contempt and something else. Something that might have been the first trace of unease wearing the costume of contempt. You're holding a grudge. That's what this is. Elias said nothing. That's the stupidest reason I've ever heard for a man to stay somewhere he's not wanted. You'd know more about stupid reasons than I would, Elias said pleasantly. The table went very quiet. Callum behind the bar found something to occupy himself with in the direction of the far end of the counter. The 2 men at the nearest card game developed sudden interest in their hands. Brett's face went through several calculations rapidly. He was sitting with Maddox at the bar, an audience he needed to perform correctly for, and a stranger across the table who was not behaving the way strangers were supposed to behave when Brett Mercer applied pressure. The performance he'd prepared for this conversation had assumed a different kind of opponent. I'll make you an offer, Brett said, and his voice had flattened out. Less performance, more transaction. $50. You ride out tomorrow morning and we don't have to continue whatever this is. Elias looked at him. No. That's more than you're likely to make in a month at whatever it is you do. Probably, Elias said. Still no. Brett leaned forward slightly. Then tell me what it's going to cost. Because there's a number. There's always a number. There's not a number, Elias said. That's what's bothering you. You keep looking for the number and it isn't there. Brett stared at him. And for the first time since the boardwalk, the first time in what was probably a longer span than that, something in his expression had no prepared answer behind it. Elias stood up. Thanks for the drink, he said, though no drink had been offered or delivered. I'll see you around, Brett. He walked out of the Powderhorn the same way he'd walked, in steady pace. No urgency, hands loose at his sides. Behind him he heard Brett say something to Maddox in a low voice. He didn't catch the words. He didn't need to. The night turned cold fast, the way October nights did in Wyoming when the wind found the valley. Elias stood outside the Powderhorn for a moment and watched the sky, which was clear enough that the stars were doing their maximum work, and then he walked the perimeter of the main street slowly. He needed to think. The meeting had gone approximately as he'd expected, not perfectly. because nothing went perfectly, but within the parameters he'd planned around. Brett was unsettled. Unsettled men made mistakes, and mistakes were what Elias was waiting for. The question was what kind of mistake Brett would make, and how quickly. He was halfway down the side street, behind the general store, when he heard footsteps behind him, not the footsteps of someone trying to be quiet, which would have been alarming, but the footsteps of someone walking fast and deliberately, trying to catch up. He turned around. Decker was a man in his 40s, with the lined, weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his adult life outdoors, and had not found it especially gentle. He was wearing his work coat and had the look of someone who'd made a decision in a hurry and hadn't given himself time second to guess it. "You're the man Walt told me about," Decker said. "I am." Decker looked up the street and down the street with the quick practiced efficiency of a man checking for witnesses. "I was in the Powderhorn tonight. Saw Brett have you brought and saw you walk out." He paused. "Brett's going to come at you. Not with a conversation, he's done with conversations. He was talking to Maddox after you left. How much time do I have? I don't know, tonight maybe. Tomorrow morning at the latest." Decker's jaw was tight. "This isn't about loyalty to you. You understand that." "I don't know you. I understand that. It's about—" Decker stopped. Started again. "I've worked that ranch for 3 years. I know what's in that locked room. I know what those records say. I've known since the 2nd year, and I told myself it wasn't my problem." His voice had the quality of a man speaking words he'd been refusing to speak for a long time and finding them heavier than he'd expected. "A man I knew, decent man, had a small operation east of here sold out 2 years ago, at half what his land was worth because Harlan made it impossible for him to do anything else. He had 4 kids. He moved his family to a room above a feed store in Casper." Elias said nothing. "I told myself it wasn't my problem," Decker said again. "I've been telling myself that for 2 years. I'm tired of the sound of it." "What are you offering?" Elias said. Decker looked at him steadily. "The room is off the main hall on the left side of the house. The lock is a standard padlock, nothing elaborate, because Harlan never thought he needed elaborate. The ledger is in the bottom drawer of a cedar cabinet against the back wall." He paused. "There's also a box of correspondence. Letters between Harlan and at least 2 county officials, written records of what was agreed and what was paid." Elias was very still. "That's more than I was expecting," he said. "I know what I'm doing," Decker said. "I've been sitting on this for 2 years. I know exactly what I'm giving you." His expression was not quite resolved. It was the expression of a man who has made a decision he can't undo and is discovering what that feels like in real time. "What happens to me? That depends on how much the investigators want from you. If you have testimony that corroborates the physical records, they'll want it. You'll be asked to give it in writing." Elias met his eyes. "Your employment ends. That's unavoidable. But men who come forward voluntarily and substantively are treated differently than men who wait to be subpoenaed." Decker absorbed this, and the inspector, "He's actually coming. He's on the road. I expect him in the next 2 days. Then you need to make sure those records don't disappear before he gets here." Decker looked at him with something that was not quite urgency and not quite desperation, but lived in the territory between them. "If Brett tells his father tonight that something is wrong, that you're not just a drifter with a grudge, Harlan will start moving things." "Would Harlan destroy the ledger?" "Harlan doesn't destroy anything he believes is protected," Decker said. "He'd move it. He has a secondary property, a line camp about 12 miles northwest. If he gets nervous, that's where things go. 12 miles. 2 hours by horse if the terrain cooperated." "How much time before Brett talks to his father?" "I don't know. Brett runs to his father when he's out of options. He's not out of options yet." Decker straightened his coat, but he's getting there. He walked back up the street without another word, moving with the purposeful normality of a man who had simply been taking an evening walk and was now returning to wherever he'd come from. Elias stood in the cold for a moment, recalculating. The timeline had compressed. He'd built the plan around having 48 hours after Calder arrived to set up the search of the property in proper legal form. But if Harlan got nervous before Calder arrived and moved the records to the line camp, the search warrant would come up empty, and the whole edifice would have a hole in its foundation, large enough to drive the Mercer operations lawyers through. He needed Calder sooner, or he needed something else. He went back to his room and sat at the small desk and thought about it for a long time. By 2 in the morning, he had a modified plan. It was not a better plan in the sense of being cleaner or more certain. It was a plan that accommodated the new constraints by adding a step that carried its own risk. But the risk was calculable, which was the most Elias ever asked of a risk. The modification involved Marshal Warren Pike. Pike was the piece Elias had been treating as a fixed negative, a corrupted official who was on the Mercer payroll and therefore useless and potentially actively dangerous. That assessment was correct as far as it went. But it stopped short of a more nuanced question. which was whether Pike was corrupt because he believed in corruption, or corrupt because he'd been frightened and bought before he'd had time to develop the kind of conviction that makes a man's dishonesty permanent. Men who'd been frightened into dishonesty rather than choosing it had a different center of gravity. They were not moral, they'd made immoral choices, and they knew it, but they also carried the weight of those choices in a way that men who were genuinely convinced had arranged things to avoid. They were vulnerable in a specific way to exactly the kind of situation that Red Hollow was about to become, a situation where the protection they'd sold themselves for was visibly failing, in public, in front of witnesses, with no cover left to stand behind. Elias had been watching Pike all week, had watched him manage the peculiar performance of a marshal who couldn't do his job without revealing why he wasn't doing it, the careful not seeing, the strategic timing of patrols that coincidentally avoided anywhere Brett Mercer was operating, the paperwork that kept him indoors on days when outdoor observation would have been inconvenient. What he'd also watched was Pike's face when Brett was conducting his public performances. The face of a man who, somewhere underneath the bureaucratic compliance, found what he was watching genuinely unpleasant and had enough self-knowledge to know that the unpleasantness reflected on him. That was the crack in the stone. Elias did not go to Pike that night. That would be the wrong move approaching a frightened man in the dark, without leverage, before the leverage existed, was how you made a frightened man run directly to the people who were paying for his fear. He went to sleep instead, an hour after the plan was settled, because a tired man made errors that rested men didn't make. In the morning, he found Nolan at the general store before the day's first customers arrived. "Your cousin's courier got off all right," Nolan said quietly, without looking up from the counter he was organizing. "Aubrey sent word back that he was on the northeast road." "Good." Elias set a small package on the counter, wrapping paper and string, the kind of thing a man might plausibly need. "What's the talk this morning?" Nolan worked the paper and string into the right spot with methodical tidiness. "Brett was at the Powderhorn late, past midnight. That's unusual. Usually he's somewhere to be seen in the evenings and then gone before it gets late." He paused. Maddox was with him, and they had Ren Casper at the table. "Casper rides out to the Mercer ranch sometimes with messages." Elias filed that, a message to Harlan, seems like. Nolan's hand stopped on the counter surface. He looked up. "Something's changed." "Something is accelerating," Elias said, "which means I need two things from you today. First, if Bessie Greer or anyone else Walt has spoken to is ready to put something in writing, complaints, observations, anything with dates and names, I need that done today, not tomorrow." Nolan's expression was carefully neutral. "And the second thing, I need you to find out if Pike had any visitors last night." Nolan looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to talk to Pike. Maybe. Pike is—" Nolan stopped. "Pike arrested my uncle 8 years ago for something that was complete fabrication. My uncle lost 3 months of income and his reputation in this town, and the charges got dropped so quietly you could barely hear it. Pike did that because Harlan Mercer wanted my uncle's water access, and my uncle said no." "I know," Elias said. "Then you know what he is." "I know what he's done," Elias said. "That's not always the same thing as what he is." He met Nolan's eyes. "I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to find out whether Mercer's man reached him last night, because that tells me how much time I have and where to apply the next move." Nolan's jaw worked. Then he nodded, once, the tight and reluctant nod of a man doing something because it's necessary and not because it feels anything close to right. "I'll find out," he said. Elias picked up his package and left the store. Outside, the morning was cold and bright, the kind of October morning that was beautiful if you had time to notice it, and just cold if you didn't. He walked toward the marshal's office at the same unhurried pace he'd maintained all week, the pace of a man without urgency, and stopped outside it. He didn't go in. He stood on the boardwalk and looked at the door for a moment, working through the conversation and then he walked past it and continued down the street. Not yet. He needed Nolan's information first. He needed to know whether Harlan already knew, because if Harlan already knew and had sent word to Pike, then Pike's calculation was already underway, and the approach required a different shape. An hour later, Nolan appeared at the boarding house with a message delivered through the efficient, invisible network of small-town communication that Elias had been watching all week. A man named Casper had reached town before midnight. He'd gone to the marshal's office and stayed 40 minutes. Harlan's Mercer knew something was wrong. Elias sat on the edge of his bed and felt the timeline contract to its final shape. He had one day, maybe less. He put on his coat and walked to the marshal's office. Pike was at his desk with the studied busyness of a man who had very little actual work and was performing having a great deal of it. He looked up when Elias came through the door, and his expression went through 3 things in rapid sequence: recognition, calculation, and the settling of something cautious and watchful behind his eyes. "Help you," Pike said. "Sit with me for 5 minutes," Elias said. He took the chair across the desk without being invited, the same move he'd made at Brett's table, the same refusal to position himself as a petitioner. What I'm going to tell you is going to be uncomfortable. I'm not interested in your reaction to it. I'm interested in the decision that comes after the reaction. Pike set down the pen he'd been holding. He did not tell Elias to get out. That in itself was information. An inspector named Calder is riding toward Red Hollow, Elias said. He's going to arrive in the next day or two. He's coming because I sent him evidence of a systematic cattle theft operation organized by Harlan Mercer over the past 6 years, and he's going to execute a search of the Mercer property under territorial authority. He paused. He's going to find what he's looking for. The records exist. I have corroboration of their location from 2 independent sources. The physical evidence, when recovered, is going to be comprehensive. Pike was very still. When that happens, Elias continued, every financial relationship between the Mercer operation and local officials is going to come under scrutiny. That includes this office. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not here to threaten you with that. I'm here because there's a window, a short one, where the choice you make determines whether you're part of the problem that gets documented or part of the solution that comes after it. Pike's jaw was tight. You're asking me to... I'm not asking you anything yet, Elias said. I'm giving you the information. What you do with it is your decision. The silence in the office was the kind that had weight. Outside, a wagon passed, the sound of it ordinary and distant, belonging to a different kind of morning than the one inside this room. Pike looked at the surface of his desk. Then he looked at Elias with something in his face that was not quite shame and not quite resolution, but had elements of both, the look of a man confronting the fact that the choices that had seemed smallest at the time they were, had turned out to be the ones that mattered most. What kind of window, he said. Elias told him. By the time he walked back out into the cold October morning, 2 things had happened that hadn't existed an hour ago. One of them he was certain of. The other he was going to have to wait and see. That, he reflected, walking back toward the boarding house with his hands in his coat pockets and his mind working through the remaining pieces, was the nature of all of it. You built the best structure you could from the materials available, and then you waited to see which parts of it held under the weight of actual events, and you tried to have enough left over to fix the parts that didn't. He had one day. Calder was riding. Red Hollow was about to find out which parts of itself had been waiting for exactly this moment, and which parts were going to resist it until the very end. Pike didn't sleep that night. Elias didn't know this for certain, but he knew it the way you know certain things about people after you've sat across from them and watched the weight land the way Pike's shoulders had changed during that conversation in the marshal's office, drop in about half an inch as the pretense of ordinary business became impossible to maintain. A man carrying what Pike was carrying didn't sleep easily on the night he stopped pretending he wasn't carrying it. Elias himself slept 4 hours, which was enough. He was up before the sky changed color, dressed in the dark without lighting the lamp, and stood at the window of his room, looking out at the empty main street below. Red Hollow at 4 a.m. was not peaceful exactly, it was suspended. The way a breath held too long is suspended, waiting for the moment it becomes unavoidable to release. He ran through the pieces one more time. Aubrey was northeast on the road, carrying the letter to Calder. Decker had given him the location of the records, the cedar cabinet in the locked room off the main hall. Walt had spent 2 days quietly building a list of people willing to speak. Nolan was positioned where he could observe and relay. Pike had been given the information and the choice, and had asked about the window, which meant he was at minimum calculating rather than simply refusing, which was more than Elias had been prepared to guarantee. What he didn't have was confirmation that Calder was where he was supposed to be on the road. He didn't have certainty about what Harlan Mercer was doing at the ranch in response to Casper's message the night before. And he didn't have any reliable read on how quickly Brett's impatience would move from the conversation kind to the physical kind. Those 3 uncertainties sat in his chest like stones of different weights, and he spent the pre-dawn hour arranging them by which one he could influence, and which ones he simply had to weather. Harlan was the one he could not influence and could not see. That was the stone that sat deepest. He put on his coat and went downstairs. Mrs. Tatum was already in the kitchen, which did not surprise him. She gave him coffee without being asked and set out bread and cold meat, with the efficiency of someone who has decided that a man operating under obvious pressure needs fuel more than he needs conversation. He ate standing at the counter, watching the window above the basin lighten by degrees. The Mercer boy came by last night, Mrs. Tatum said, without looking up from whatever she was organizing near the stove. Elias set down his cup. Brett, not Brett. A man who works for the family. Young, maybe 22, I didn't know him. She kept her hands busy. He knocked. I told him we had no vacancies. What did he want? He asked if the man with the gray mare was still in residence. She paused. I told him I didn't discuss my guests, and he left. He left. She finally looked at him. I've had guests here for 30 years. I know when someone's checking whether a person is still in place. Her voice was dry and absolutely clear. Whatever you're doing, do it quickly. This town doesn't have a long tolerance for situations. I know, Elias said. Thank you, Mrs. Tatum. She waved one hand in a gesture that dismissed both the thanks and any sentiment attached to it, and went back to the stove. He was out the door before full light. The first thing he did was check on the gray mare, which was his habit on mornings when he needed to think and needed the thinking to go somewhere useful. The livery stable at that hour was warm with animal heat and smelled of hay and worked leather, and Walt was already there earlier than usual, which meant Walt had heard something or was expecting something or both. Casper rode back out before midnight, Walt said, the moment Elias came through the stable door. He was running a curry comb over a roan gelding belonging to one of the other boarders, and he spoke without stopping the motion, back toward the Mercer ranch. So Harlan got the message and sent back a response. That's my read. Walt's jaw worked. Harlan doesn't usually send riders back the same night unless it's urgent. He paused. Decker didn't come in to work this morning. Elias looked at him. At all, stable owner expected him at 6. It's past now. Elias thought about this. Decker not showing up could mean several things. It could mean Decker had gotten cold feet and decided that his 2-year-old crisis of conscience was less compelling in the cold light of morning than it had seemed at 11 at night in the street behind the general store. It could mean Decker was sick. It could mean something had happened at the ranch that had made his absence involuntary. The last possibility was the one that required immediate attention. Is there anyone who lives near Decker? Elias said. Anyone who would know if he left the ranch this morning or if something was different out there, Walt thought. A woman named Pruitt. She has a place about 2 miles from the Mercer property on the North Road. Her son runs cattle on the same creek. He'd passed the Mercer property this morning if he was moving his animals to the upper pasture, which he does most Wednesdays. Can you reach him? I can try. Walt set down the curry comb. It'll take time. An hour, Elias said. I need to know in an hour whether something happened at the ranch last night. Walt nodded and left through the back of the stable. Elias stood with the gray mare for a few minutes, his hand on her neck, feeling her warmth and the solid reality of her. She turned her head and looked at him with the large, patient eye of an animal that had been through enough miles with this particular person to have developed a qualified trust in his judgment. He appreciated the trust and was not entirely sure it was warranted. He left the stable and walked toward the main street. The morning was doing what October mornings did in that part of Wyoming, burning off the night cold slowly. The sun coming up at an angle that lit the tops of things while the street level was still in shade. The light having a quality of thin clarity that made everything look more precise than it actually was. He walked the length of the main street once, watching how the town assembled itself for the day, noting which doors opened and in what sequence, which men moved with purpose and which ones were checking to see what was happening before committing to any particular direction. Red Hollow on this morning had a different texture than it had on the mornings before. Something had moved through it overnight, some information or some anxiety, and people who were good at reading ordinary mornings could feel it without being able to name exactly what had changed. Finch's general store opened on schedule, but Finch himself stood in the doorway for a full minute before going back inside, which was not his pattern. 2 men near the feed store were talking in the compressed, low-toned way that meant the conversation was about something that mattered, and they weren't sure who might be listening. Elias caught Nolan's eye through the window of the general store. Nolan made a small movement with his head a-tilt toward the alley beside the building. Elias kept walking for another half block, then turned casually and came around through the back. Nolan was waiting at the side door, coat on, as if he'd stepped out for a moment on an errand. Brett was at the Powder Horn again last night, after you left the marshal's office, Nolan said. Later than the night before, he had Maddox and another man I didn't recognize, not local. The barkeep said they were there until past midnight. A man not local, Elias said. Description, tall. Older than Maddox. Carries himself like he's been hired for specific purposes before. Nolan's voice was flat. Callum said Brett called him Harker. Elias filed the name. A man brought in from outside meant Brett was either expanding his options or had been told by his father to expand them. Either way, it indicated that the Mercer response to whatever Casper had reported the previous night was not to wait and see. There's more, Nolan said. He looked uncomfortable in the specific way of someone delivering information they're not sure they should have. My cousin Bessie, she does laundry for half the households in this town, including some of the men who work for the Mercers. One of them brought in a load yesterday evening, which was unusual timing. He was talking not to her directly, but talking the way people talk when they're nervous and think the person nearby is just the laundry woman. He stopped. What did he say? He said. Harlan told Brett to clean up whatever mess the stranger had made. Those were the words, clean up the mess. Nolan met his eyes. I don't know what that means exactly. I know what it sounds like. Elias knew what it sounded like too. All right, he said. All right, Nolan repeated with an edge of disbelief at the calmness of it. You understand what I just told you. I understand. Elias looked at him steadily. Go back inside. Be ordinary. If Bessie or anyone else on Walt's list is ready to write down what they know, today is the day. He paused. And if anything changes quickly, if you see Brett or Maddox or this man Harker moving with purpose toward the boarding house or the livery stable, or anywhere I might be, find a way to let me know. Nolan stared at him. However you can, Elias said. Even if it's just walking in the same direction. He went back around to the main street. The hour Walt had asked for stretched to an hour and 20 minutes, during which Elias covered a considerable amount of Red Hollow's geography at a pace designed to look purposeless and was anything but. He went to the boarding house and retrieved 2 items from his room, the folded notes from the inside pocket of his coat, and a second document he'd been keeping in the lining of his saddlebag, a copy of the most critical portions of the evidence he'd compiled, written in a different hand from the originals, which he'd made specifically in case the originals were lost or taken. He sealed this copy inside an envelope and addressed it to the circuit inspector's office, with a notation that it was to be held for Calder. He left it with Mrs. Tatum, who took it without asking what it was, looked at the address, and said she'd get it to the stage office before noon. If anything happens to me before noon, Elias said, get it there before anything else. Mrs. Tatum looked at him for a long moment. You expecting something to happen to you? I'm preparing for the possibility. She put the envelope inside her apron pocket with the decisive motion of someone who has just added a task to a list and intends to complete it. I'll go this morning, she said. Stage leaves at 10. He thanked her and went back out. Walt found him near the end of the main street, coming from the north end of town, moving fast but not running the walk of a man who had urgent information and was intelligent enough not to broadcast it with his pace. Pruitt's son came back on the north road about 40 minutes ago, Walt said, falling into step beside Elias without breaking the appearance of 2 men walking in the same direction by coincidence. He said the Mercer property looked active last night. Lights on late in the main house. This morning, 2 men he didn't recognize were in the yard by the barn. Decker, Elias said. Pruitt's boy didn't see Decker. He said the regular hands were at work, but the 2 new men weren't working. They were positioned. Walt's voice was tight. He described it as watching. Men positioned to watch. Elias absorbed this and felt the timeline collapse another full day. If Harlan had brought men in from outside Harker in town for Brett, unknown men positioned at the ranch, then Harlan had moved from the contingency stage to the active stage. He was no longer waiting to see what the stranger in town was doing. He had decided that whatever it was needed to be stopped, and he was organizing the stopping of it. The ledger was the question. Was it still in the locked room, or had Harlan moved it during the night? Decker's absence suggested that Harlan might have discovered or suspected that someone on the inside had talked. If Harlan suspected the locked room was compromised, the first thing he would do was move what was in it. I need to reach Calder today, Elias said. Not tomorrow. Today. Walt shook his head. Aubrey's out on the road. We have no way. Does Pruitt's son know the northeast road? Walt looked at him. He travels it some. Would he ride out this morning if he was asked right now? A pause. He might. He's a decent man. He doesn't like the Mercers either. They pushed his mother off a water access 2 years ago, and Pike wrote it up as a boundary dispute and closed the file. Find him, Elias said. I need him to ride northeast and intercept Aubrey, or find Calder directly. He needs to tell Calder the timeline has moved, that the ranch needs to be searched today, not in 2 days. That the records are at risk. He was already reaching into his coat. I'll write it in 2 sentences. Calder will understand the rest. Walt took the note 30 seconds later and moved off toward the north end of town. Elias stood at the edge of the main street and looked toward the Powder Horn, where he could see from this distance a figure on the boardwalk that had the build and stance of Cole Maddox. Maddox was watching the street. Specifically, Maddox was watching the section of the street where Elias was standing. Elias held the eye contact across the distance for a moment, or what approximated eye contact at 40 yards when you couldn't actually see the other man's eyes, and then he walked in the direction of the marshal's office. Pike was in. He'd been in all morning, which Elias knew because he'd been monitoring the office door at intervals, and Pike's horse had been at the hitching post outside since before 7, with no sign of having been anywhere. A marshal who stayed inside all morning when there was an active situation developing in his town was a marshal in the middle of a decision. Elias came in without knocking. Pike looked up, and his expression was the expression of a man who had been expecting this and had not managed to entirely prepare for it. Tell me where you are, Elias said. Pike set down the pen as again the same pen, Elias thought. or one that served the same purpose of giving his hands something to do that wasn't reacting. "Where am," he said, "with this today." "Where you are." The marshal's office was a small room with a desk and 2 chairs and a gun rack on the wall that held a shotgun and a rifle that both needed cleaning, and a window that looked out onto the side street rather than the main street, which was either an architectural oversight or a deliberate feature for a man who'd spent 4 years managing what he didn't see. Pike sat in his chair and looked like a man who was about the size of his choices and not comfortable with the measurement. "I spent most of last night thinking about what you told me," Pike said. "I figured. I kept trying to find the version of this where I did nothing, and it came out manageable." He paused. "I couldn't find that version. There isn't one," Elias said. "When Calder arrives, he arrives with territorial authority that supersedes this office. What happens in the next few hours determines whether you're the marshal who aided a federal investigation or the marshal who was investigated alongside the people he was supposed to be policing." "You're not subtle," Pike said. "I stopped being subtle yesterday morning. We're past the part of this where subtle is useful." Pike was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse went past on the side street at a trot, someone moving with purpose. Neither of them looked at the window. "Harlan Mercer's brought men in," Elias said. 2 at the ranch property, possibly more. A man named Harker in town with Brett. The records in that locked room are at risk of being moved or destroyed before the inspector arrives." He leaned forwards slightly. "I need you to ride out to the Mercer property this morning. I need you to secure that room under your authority as marshal pending federal inspection. I need you to do it in the next 2 hours." Pike's face went through something complicated. "If I ride out there, Harlan, we'll know that the game is done," Elias said. "Yes. But the alternative is that Harlan moves those records to the line camp 12 miles northwest, and when Calder arrives tomorrow or the day after with his search authority, there's nothing to find." He paused. "And you have a second problem. If Harlan gets those records moved, the case the inspector builds is thinner. Thinner cases look for secondary targets. Secondary targets in a corruption case involving a local marshal tend to get looked at with a great deal of attention." Pike closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something in them was different, not quite resolved, but on the far side of the final piece of internal argument. "I'll need a deputy," he said. "I can't ride out to the Mercer property alone. Harlan has men." "I'll go with you," Elias said. "You're a private citizen." "Then deputize me for the day," Elias said. "You have the authority." Pike looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened the desk drawer and took out a worn tin star and set it on the desk between them. "Don't make me regret this more than I already regret everything else," Pike said. Elias picked up the badge and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll do my best." They rode out of Red Hollow at 9:30, 2 men on the north road that led eventually to the Mercer property 3 miles out, the morning cold, settling around them with the particular indifference of weather to human urgency. Pike rode with the rigid posture of a man braced for something he couldn't quite see yet. Elias rode beside him at the same pace, watching the road ahead and the scrub on both sides with the peripheral attention that had kept him intact through situations worse than this one. Neither of them talked much. "About a mile out," Pike said. "How'd you end up in this line of work?" Elias considered the question. "I was a Cattlemen's Association investigator for 4 years. Before that, I worked livestock for a man in New Mexico who had a similar situation to what you've got here. The situation didn't resolve well. I took what I'd learned and started working independently." "Didn't resolve well," Pike said. "For who?" "For the man who hired me. He sold out before we could finish building the case." Elias watched a hawk move off a fence post as they passed. "I've thought about it since. Thought about what I should have done differently to move faster." He paused. "The answer is usually that I should have gotten to the marshal sooner." Pike was quiet for a moment. "That's a pointed thing to say on this particular road." "I know," Elias said. The Mercer property came into view, gradually first the fence line, then the shape of the outbuildings, then the main house sitting back from the road, with the particular solidity of a structure that had been built to last and to look like it was built to last. It was a substantial property, the kind that communicated its owner's prosperity in the same way that the owner communicated it, not with ostentation, but with a settled, permanent confidence that assumed no need to explain itself. A man Elias didn't recognize appeared at the gate before they reached it. Not one of the regular hands. The posture was wrong. Too alert, too oriented toward the riders approaching rather than toward the work of the property. One of the 2 Walt's contact had reported this morning. "Marshal," the man said when they pulled up. "I need to speak with Harlan Mercer," Pike said. His voice was steady, which Elias noted and credited. "Mr. Mercer's not available this morning." "He'll make himself available," Pike said. "Official business." The man at the gate 40s, heavy through the shoulders, carrying a rifle across his forearms in the casual way of someone for whom rifles across forearms are a habitual posture, looked at Pike, then at Elias, and then back at Pike. "Who's this?" he said. "Deputy," Pike said. A pause. Then the man stepped back from the gate and let them through. They rode up to the main house and dismounted at the post near the front door. Two more hands were visible in the yard, regular ranch workers, by the look of them, occupied with legitimate tasks and actively not looking at the marshal's arrival, which meant they'd been told to stay clear of whatever was happening. The front door of the house opened before they reached it. Harlan Mercer was 61 years old and looked like the kind of man who had spent 61 years being right about things and had developed, from the accumulated experience of being right, a quality of absolute stillness that was more unnerving than bluster. He was a large man, not physically imposing, but spatially commanding, the kind of man who occupied the space he was standing in completely, leaving no room for ambiguity about where he was and what he was doing there. He looked at Pike with the expression of a man looking at something that has ceased to be useful. "Warren's," he said. The name came out flat, stripped of any social warmth, just a label applied to an object. "Harlan." Pike dismounted fully and stood his ground, which took visible effort. "I need to see the room off the main hall. The locked one." A silence descended over the front yard that was so complete that the distant sound of cattle somewhere behind the barn became for a moment the loudest thing in it. "On what authority?" Harlan said. "Marshal's authority, pending federal inspection. I've received information that the room contains materials relevant to an ongoing investigation." Harlan's eyes moved to Elias. They stayed there for several seconds, not the reactive look of a man encountering a surprise, but the measuring look of a man confirming a suspicion he'd already had time to develop. "You're the drifter," Harlan said. "I've been called that," Elias said. "My son slapped you last week, and you've spent 6 days dismantling 30 years of my work." It was not quite a question. It was an assessment, delivered with a kind of cold precision that was almost in its way respectful. "I should have sent him away to school." "Probably would have helped," Elias said. Harlan looked back at Pike. "I want this in writing. Whatever authority you think you're exercising. You'll have it when the inspector arrives," Pike said. "I'm here now. The room now." Another silence. Harlan's jaw moved slightly, the microscopic calculation of a man running through remaining options and finding them narrower than he'd expected. He turned and walked inside. They followed. The main hall of the Mercer house was wide and well appointed in the functional way of a man who valued quality, without much interest in decoration, good wood, solid construction, nothing frivolous. Halfway down the hall on the left side was a door with a padlock on it, exactly as Decker had described. Harlan stopped in front of it and turned. "I want your badge number and your signature on a complaint if this turns out to be nothing." "You'll have it," Pike said. "Open the door." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a key and unlocked the padlock. He pushed the door open and stepped back. The room was exactly as Decker had described: a cedar cabinet against the back wall, a desk, shelves of ranch records in orderly arrangement. The cedar cabinet was there. The bottom drawer was there. What was not there was the ledger. The bottom drawer was open. It was empty. Elias felt the bottom fall out of the morning in a specific and sickening way. He kept his face still and walked to the cabinet and pulled the drawer all the way out. Checked behind it. Checked the drawer above it. Opened each drawer of the cabinet in sequence. Empty, empty, empty. Harlan Mercer stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has just watched a trap spring on the wrong animal. "Seems like there's nothing here, Warren," he said. Pike's face was rigid. He looked at Elias. Elias looked at the cabinet. Looked at the desk. Looked at the room. The ledger was gone. Moved sometime in the night, after Casper had delivered his message before this morning. 12 miles northwest to the line camp. Just as Decker had said Harlan would do if he got nervous. 12 miles. Elias had 1 hour, maybe 2, before this became the kind of failure that couldn't be recovered from. He turned and walked back out of the room, past Harlan, down the main hall, and out the front door. Pike caught up to him at the horses. "It's gone," Pike said. "It's at the line camp." Elias was already doing the math. 12 miles northwest, riding hard, 40 minutes. If Calder was on the road and Pruitt's son had found him, if Calder was riding toward Red Hollow, he would come from the northeast. The line camp was northwest. An inspector couldn't search a secondary property without specific authority that named that property. The original information Elias had sent named the ranch house, not the line camp. He needed the ledger back on this property before Calder arrived, or he needed Calder to arrive at the line camp instead of the ranch house. "Can you hold this property?" Elias said. "Officially, right now. Keep Harlan from sending anyone to the line camp." Pike looked at him. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that you're a territorial marshal who has identified probable cause related to a federal investigation and you are securing the scene pending the inspector's arrival." Elias met his eyes. "Those are the actual grounds. They're real. They'll hold." Pike looked back at the front door where Harlan had appeared and was watching them from the top step. "He'll send for Brett," Pike said. "Brett will come with Maddox and that other man." "I know," Elias said. "Can you hold it?" A pause that lasted about 3 seconds and contained a significant amount of human interior territory. "Yes," Pike said. "Then hold it," Elias said. "I'm going to the line camp." He swung up onto the gray mare before Pike could respond and put her onto the northwest road at a pace that the cold October air immediately pushed back against. Behind him, he heard Harlan Mercer's voice, sharp and carrying, issuing an instruction to someone in the yard. He didn't look back. The line camp was 12 miles and he needed to cover it in 40 minutes. The gray mare had covered ground like this before, and she covered it now without complaint, finding her pace on the northwest road as it left the valley floor and began to climb through low scrubby hills. Elias rode with his weight forward and his eyes on the road ahead, splitting attention between the terrain and the calculation he was running. If he reached the line camp and the ledger was there, he had several options, and none of them were clean. He couldn't legally seize it himself. He was technically a deputy for the day, by Pike's authority, but a local deputy's jurisdiction over evidence in a federal case was genuinely questionable, and Harlan Mercer's would have lawyers who'd make the most of that question. He could secure the camp and wait for Calder, but if Calder arrived at the ranch house first, the time lag between redirecting him northwest would cost at least 2 hours. He could send someone back for Calder, but he didn't have someone to send. What he needed was for Calder to not go to the ranch house at all. He was 7 miles out on the northwest road, the mare breathing hard in the cold air when he saw the rider. Coming from the north, intersecting the northwest road about half a mile ahead, was a rider moving fast, and behind him, at a controlled but purposeful pace, 2 more riders. The first rider was Aubrey. Even at this distance, the slight frame and the specific horse were identifiable. Aubrey, who had left Red Hollow yesterday morning on the northeast road with Elias's letter, had apparently found what he was looking for and turned around. The 2 riders behind him were not from Red Hollow. Elias pushed the mare to close the gap. When they met on the road, Aubrey pulled up with the expression of someone who has been riding hard and is relieved to have encountered the exact person he was looking for. "Found him yesterday afternoon," Aubrey said, breathing unevenly. "About 15 miles northeast. He was already moving this direction." The first of the 2 riders behind Aubrey came up alongside. He was a man in his 50s, compact and deliberate in his movements, wearing a coat that had seen considerable road use and carrying a document case across his saddlebag that had the specific, utilitarian look of official business. "You're Rourke," the man said. "Not a question, Calder," Elias said. The inspector's eyes were the color of weathered oak and had the quality of eyes that had spent decades looking at things and separating what was real from what was presented as real. He looked at Elias for approximately 2 seconds and seemed to arrive at a complete assessment. "Your letter said the ranch house," Calder said. "Your second rider said the situation changed." "The records were moved," Elias said, "last night. They're at a secondary property, a line camp 12 miles northwest. I'm on the road to it now." Calder looked at the road ahead. Then he looked at the document case on his saddlebag. "My authority names the Mercer Ranch property, I know," Elias said. "But there's a marshal currently holding the ranch property who can provide testimony that the records were moved from that property to the line camp after he was notified of the investigation. That constitutes evidence of removal during an investigation, which falls under the ranch property authority as a secondary location of the same evidence." Calder studied him. "You've thought about this for the last 2 hours," Elias said. The inspector was quiet for a moment. His second rider, younger, probably a territorial deputy, waited without expression. "The marshal will actually provide that testimony," Calder said. "Yes," Elias said, and believed it, which he had not been entirely certain he would be able to say 24 hours ago. Calder looked at the northwest road. "Then let's go find this line camp," he said. They rode the remaining 5 miles to the line camp at a pace that was fast without being reckless, and when the camp came into view, a small, solid structure in a depression between 2 low ridges, a corral to one side with 2 horses in it, Elias felt the specific kind of alertness that came from knowing you were about to find out whether the architecture you'd built over the past week was going to stand or fall. There was a man at the camp, one man sitting outside on a wooden box, and when he saw 3 riders coming down the slope toward him, he stood up slowly with the resignation of someone who has been left in a place with a task and no instructions for this particular situation. He was young. Not Decker. Elias didn't know him. A ranch hand, placed here to guard what had been brought, with no specific guidance about what to do if a federal inspector arrived with a locally deputized private citizen and a territorial deputy. Calder produced his credentials before the man could find a response. "I'm here to secure materials relevant to a federal investigation," Calder said. His voice was the voice of a man who had done this before in enough places that the words came out without effort, but with complete authority. You are not obstructing this, you're standing aside. The young man looked at the three of them, looked at the structure behind him, made a calculation that favored his own future over his employer's present crisis. He stepped aside. The ledger was inside, on a table. The box of correspondence was beside it. Neither had been touched since they'd been placed there. Calder opened the ledger, read 3 pages, closed it. He looked at Elias with an expression that was professionally neutral and could not entirely contain what was underneath it. 6 years, he said. At minimum, Elias said. The records go back further, but 6 years is what I can document. Calder handed the ledger to his deputy, who wrapped it with the specific care of someone handling material that has just become extremely important. The box of correspondence followed. Elias stood in the doorway of the line camp and looked out at the northwest hills and felt something decompress in his chest that had been compressed for approximately 6 days. It wasn't over. There was still the ranch property, and Brett in town with Maddox and Harker, and a dozen things that could still go sideways before the end of it. But the ledger was in Calder's hands now, and Calder was not a man who put things down once he'd picked them up. The line camp was 11 miles from Red Hollow. They had a ride back through the cold morning air, and on the far end of that ride, the part of this that had always been the most visible and the most volatile Brett Mercer, in a town that was about to watch everything his father had built come apart, was still waiting to resolve itself. Elias turned back toward the horses. "We should move," he said, "before Brett figures out where we went." The ride back from the line camp took 40 minutes that felt considerably longer than 40 minutes. The cold had deepened through the morning, and the northwest wind was in their faces on the return, which made conversation difficult and thinking easier, which suited Elias well enough. He rode slightly ahead of Calder and the deputy, not because he was leading them. Calder was not a man who needed leading, but because his mind was already in Red Hollow, working through what they were riding back into. The ledger and the correspondence box were secured in Calder's saddlebag, wrapped and strapped with the methodical care of a man who understood that physical evidence had a way of becoming contested and needed to be unimpeachably handled from the moment of recovery. That part was done. That part was finally out of Elias's hands, and in hands better suited to carry it. What remained in his hands was Brett. Brett, who had been in the Powderhorn past midnight with Maddox and a hired man named Harker. Brett, who had received some version of his father's instructions through Casper's midnight ride, and had translated those instructions into action. Action that, by this point in the morning, had been running for several hours without anyone in Red Hollow knowing what shape it had taken. Elias had been away from town for nearly 3 hours. 3 hours was enough time for a man like Brett, operating with money and armed support, and the still functional belief that his family's power was a fixed condition rather than a collapsing one, to do several kinds of damage. He pushed the mare a little harder on the flat section before the valley, and she gave him what he asked for without complaint. They came into Red Hollow from the northwest, which brought them in along the back edge of the residential properties before reaching the main street. Elias saw the shape of the town from this approach, the way you saw a familiar face from an unfamiliar angle recognizably itself, but showing features that the usual perspective hid. What he saw from this angle as they came down toward the main street was a crowd. Not large, maybe 30 people, but gathered in the way that crowds gathered around something rather than gathered for something. Clustered near the center of the main street, their collective attention oriented toward a specific point that Elias couldn't yet see clearly from the north end approach. He heard Brett's voice before he could see him. It was carrying the way voices carry when they've been raised for an audience, and the speaker has stopped caring what the audience thinks of them. The particular volume and register of someone who has arrived at the place past frustration, where everything becomes very simple and very loud. Elias came around the last property line onto the main street and saw the whole of it in a single glance. Brett was standing in the middle of the street with Maddox to his right and the man Harker to his left. Maddox had his hand near his holster in the explicit, unambiguous way of a man who has been told to be ready and is communicating that readiness to the crowd around him. Harker was still in the specific stillness of a man being paid to be still until he isn't. Across from them, standing alone in front of the general store with his back against the wall and his hands visible at his sides, was Nolan Pierce. Nolan's face was the color of old ash. He was holding himself together with visible effort, the locked jaw, the controlled breathing of someone who had been frightened past the point where fear shows itself as trembling, and had arrived at the place where it shows itself as stillness. Brett had him. Not physically, there was 6 feet of open street between them, but in every other sense. Brett had found the one person who had been visible enough in Elias's movements through the week to be identified as connected, and he had placed himself in front of that person in the middle of the main street with 2 armed men in front of a gathered crowd in the broad October daylight. It was, Elias recognized with a cold and specific clarity, Exactly the kind of move Brett knew how to make. Not subtle, not strategic effective. He heard Calder's horse come up beside him. "The man in the street," Calder said, his voice low and even. "That's Brett Mercer," Elias said. "Harlan's son." "And the young man against the wall." "He's with me," Elias said. "He's got nothing to do with anything legally. He's a store clerk." Calder took in the configuration of the scene with the rapid practiced assessment of a man who had ridden into the aftermath of several situations in his career and had learned to read them fast. "How do you want to handle this?" "I'll handle it," Elias said. "Stay back until I need you forward." He rode directly into the space between the crowd's edge and Brett's position, and when Brett registered who was on the horse and where he'd come from, the performance he'd been delivering to the assembled townspeople underwent a visible shift, not stopping exactly, but pausing in the way that a machine pauses when an unexpected input arrives. Elias dismounted. He didn't tie the mare, he dropped the reins and let her stand, knowing she'd hold, and he walked the remaining distance on foot, because the distance that mattered here was not measured in yards. "You've been busy," Brett said, and his voice had the quality of something past its best argument, reaching for the register that had always worked before, and finding it didn't quite land the same way. "Let him go," Elias said. "He works for you." Brett glanced at Nolan with the contemptuous ease of a man displaying a captured thing. "My father had a message sent last night. This morning I find out the marshal rode out to our property on some made-up official business, and somehow you're the deputy." The word came out with a specific disgust. "And this boy here, he's been running your errands all week." "Stacked shelves in a general store," Elias said. "That's all he did." "That's not what I heard." "Brett." Elias stopped at a distance of 8 feet and stood still. "Listen to me. Whatever you've heard, whatever Casper told your father last night, whatever your father told you to do this morning, it's done. It's already done." He kept his voice level, not soft, not loud. "Inspector Calder is on the north end of this street with the records from your father's line camp in his saddlebag. The ledger, the correspondence, all of it." The crowd had gone very quiet. Brett's face did something complicated. The performance layer of it, the audience-facing confidence that had been his default expression for 26 years, went through a visible contraction, the way a fire contracts when the air feeding it is cut off. Underneath it, for just a moment, was something else entirely. "Younger, less certain, you're lying," Brett said. "I'm not," Elias said, a pause. Brett looked at Maddox. Maddox was looking at the north end of the street, where Calder and the deputy had moved their horses forward to the edge of the gathered crowd, and were now visible to everyone present. "That's a federal inspector's badge on that man's coat," someone in the crowd said. The voice was quiet but carried. Brett looked north, looked at Calder, looked at the document case secured to Calder's saddle, with the particular strapping of official material in transit. "Make your choice," Elias said quietly. "Not for me. For yourself. Right now in front of these people. Because what you do in the next 30 seconds is going to be the thing you can't take back." Brett's jaw was tight. His eyes moved between Elias and Calder and the crowd and Maddox. And what was happening behind them was the collapse of a particular architecture of certainty, not dramatic, not instantaneous, but visible the way a wall is visible when it's deciding whether to stand or fall, the moment before it commits to either. "Your father's records are in federal hands," Elias said. "The marshal is at your father's property right now, securing the scene. Harlan is going to be taken into custody before dark." He paused. "This is the part where you decide whether you make it worse or you stop." Maddox said something in a low voice to Brett. Elias didn't catch the words. Brett's response was sharp and short. Then Brett looked at Harker. Harker, who had been still this entire time, shifted his weight very slightly. His hand moved toward the inside of his coat. Elias moved. Not dramatically, there was no drama in the movement, no flourish. It was simply the fastest available action executed with the minimum necessary force. He closed the 8 feet between himself and Harker in 2 steps, caught the man's right arm before the hand completed its motion, and applied leverage to the elbow joint in the specific way that made continuing the motion both impossible and extremely educational about the consequences of attempting it. Harker made a short, involuntary sound. The firearm that had been approximately 3 inches from clearing Harker's coat did not clear it. The crowd pulled back a step collectively, the way crowds do when something sudden happens in the space they're watching. Elias held the arm, kept the leverage applied, and looked at Maddox. Maddox had his hand on his holster. His hand was there, and it was not moving, which was either a decision to wait or a decision that had not yet become a decision. "Don't," Elias said. From the north end of the street, Calder's voice, unhurried, carrying the specific weight of territorial authority, came clearly through the cold air. "Cole Maddox, remove your hand from that weapon." Maddox looked at Calder, looked at Elias, looked at Brett. Brett said nothing. Brett was standing in the middle of the main street of Red Hollow, with the crowd around him and Harker's arm controlled, and Calder's badge visible 40 feet away, and the architecture of his entire life falling in the specific, unavoidable way of things that have been built on a false foundation. Maddox took his hand away from the holster slowly, with the deliberate visibility of a man making sure the gesture was unambiguous. Elias released Harker's arm. Harker stepped back and held both his hands at his sides and looked at the ground with the expression of a man reassessing his recent employment decisions. The crowd was absolutely still. Brett was still too. Standing in the street, not moving, not speaking, the performance finally and completely stopped. He looked at Elias with an expression that had cleared of everything else and was left with what was underneath all of it, not malice. Not arrogance, but a young man who had never once been shown the outside of his own certainty, standing in it for the first time and finding the view not at all what he'd expected. "Your only choice now is whether you walk or you're carried," Elias said. He wasn't unkind when he said it. He wasn't kind either. It was just what was true. Brett looked at the crowd around him, the shopkeepers, the working men and women of Red Hollow, people who had been stepping aside for the Mercer name for 6 years, who had learned the particular survival skill of not seeing what it was inconvenient to see. They were all looking back at him now. Not with triumph, most of them. With the complicated expression of people who had been waiting for something to be over, and were watching it become over, and were not entirely sure yet what over looked like for them. Marshal Warren Pike came around the south end of the main street on his horse at a steady walk, returning from the Mercer property. He pulled up at the edge of the gathered crowd, took in the configuration of the scene with the rapid assessment of a man who'd been doing this kind of reading for 20 years, most of it in service of the wrong side. He dismounted. He walked through the crowd. He stopped beside Elias. He looked at Brett Mercer for a long moment. Then he said, "Brett Mercer, you're under arrest." The arrest was not clean because nothing about it had any business being clean. Brett didn't fight that, at least, was true. But he didn't go quietly either. What he did was stand there in the street for a period of seconds that felt longer than they were. And then he said, "My father is going to burn every piece of paper Calder found before this goes any further." And his voice had the last flicker of the certainty he'd been operating on his entire life. The certainty that money and power and the right connections could solve anything. "Your father's property is secured," Pike said. "He's not burning anything." Brett looked at him with an expression of genuine bewilderment, the bewilderment of someone encountering a piece of the world that was supposed to be fixed and has moved. "You work for us," he said. "The U.S. carried everything. The 6 years, the envelopes, the carefully maintained blindness, the arrangement that had seemed permanent because it had lasted long enough to feel that way." "Not today," Pike said. He put his hand on Brett's arm, and Brett, after another moment of the fixed bewilderment, let himself be walked toward the marshal's office without further argument. Not because he had accepted any of it, more because the part of his mind that understood immediate physical reality had registered what the other part was still refusing to process. That Maddox was not going to move, that Harker was standing with his hands at his sides, that the crowd around him was not a crowd he could perform for anymore, and that the man walking him toward the marshal's office was, improbably and definitively, not going to stop. Maddox watched Brett go, and then looked at Elias with an expression that was professional rather than personal, the expression of a man who had been employed for a specific purpose, and was noting that the purpose had concluded. "You're not a deputy," Maddox said. "For today I am," Elias said. Maddox looked at Calder, looked at the document case, made the same calculation that Harker had made at the edge of Elias's leverage on his arm, and arrived at the same destination. "I'll need to know what I'm being held for." "That's a conversation for the marshal's office," Calder said, coming up to them. "You'll have it." Maddox went without further argument. Harker fell in beside him with the air of a man who had been in this position before and had developed from the experience a practical philosophy about when resistance was useful and when it wasn't. The crowd stayed where it was for a moment after they'd all gone. Brett, Maddox, Harker, Pike, as if collectively uncertain what to do with the space that had just opened up. Then, gradually, individuals began to separate from it. A woman near the front walked back toward the general store, past Nolan, who was still standing with his back against the wall, but whose color had come back and whose hands had stopped doing the careful, deliberate work of staying still. Elias walked over to him. Nolan looked at him. He looked like he'd spent the last hour getting older than his age should have allowed for, and was still in the process of catching up to it. "How long were you standing there?" Elias said. "About an hour," Nolan said. His voice was steady, which was more than Elias would have predicted given what his face was doing. "They came to the store looking for you. I told them I didn't know where you'd gone." He paused. Brett didn't like that answer. "I'm sorry," Elias said. Nolan looked at him with something complicated, not quite resentment, not quite absolution, something the territory between them that was going to take more than this particular conversation to resolve. "Don't be sorry," Nolan said finally. "Just make sure what just happened is actually what it looks like." "It's what it looks like," Elias said. Calder spent the afternoon at the marshal's office with his deputy and a growing stack of documents, and what happened there was the methodical, unspectacular work of federal authority being applied to a situation that had been created by the absence of it. Statements were taken. Documents were inventoried. The process was thorough and showed no inclination toward speed, which Elias understood was the correct approach, and found, after a week of urgency, almost physically difficult to watch. He sat outside the marshal's office on the bench that ran along the front of the building and drank coffee that Mrs. Tatum sent over by way of a young girl who was apparently her niece, and watched Red Hollow do the thing that towns do after something significant, shifts the careful, disbelieving recalibration of what was possible and what wasn't. It showed in small things. Garrett Finch came out of the general store and stood in front of it for 5 full minutes, which was unusual, and the way he stood was unusual upright, rather than the slight defensive compression he'd carried for years, looking at the main street the way someone looks at a view they'd forgotten they had access to. A woman Elias didn't know crossed the street and stopped to talk to Bessie Greer outside the laundry, and what they said was private, but the way they said it without the peripheral checking for who was watching was not. Walt Pierce came and sat beside Elias on the bench without saying anything for a few minutes. Decker came in, Walt said eventually. Elias looked at him. Came into the stable around noon. He'd been at his sister's place on the east side of the valley, apparently. Left the ranch last night, after Casper arrived, because he saw which direction things were moving, and decided he didn't want to be present for any of it. Walt shook his head. I'm not sure if that's cowardice or good sense. It's both, Elias said. Same thing sometimes. He wants to give a statement, Walt said. Calder's men talked to him for about an hour. Elias nodded. That was good. Decker's testimony about the locked room about watching the records exist and knowing what they contained was the kind of corroboration that made a federal case something other than circumstantial. What happens to Pike? Walt said. The question had the careful quality of something he'd been holding for a while. That's Calder's determination, Elias said. Not mine. You talked to Pike. You made an agreement with him. I told him the truth about what his options were. I didn't make him promises. Elias looked at the marshal's office door. He cooperated. He secured the ranch property alone, with Harlan Mercer standing 10 feet away, without backup while I was at the line camp. That's not nothing. He paused. What happens to him is still going to be bad. It's just going to be less bad than if he'd made the other choice. Walt absorbed this. He had the look of a man trying to decide whether that was justice or a compromise of justice, and not arriving at a clean answer, which was, Elias thought, probably the correct response. My cousin's name, Walt said. The complaint he filed 2 years ago. Is that part of this? Yes, Elias said. Calder has it. It goes into the record as part of the documented pattern. Walt was quiet for a moment. He's going to need to hear that, he said. From you, not from me. He stopped. He's had a hard 2 years. I know, Elias said. I'll talk to him. Harlan Mercer arrived in Red Hollow at 4:30 in the afternoon, which was not voluntary. 2 territorial deputies who had come with Calder from the circuit rode out to the ranch property after lunch and came back with Harlan and with 2 of the ranch's senior hands who had been identified in the correspondence as knowing participants. The man who'd been at the gate that morning came back too, and Harker, and the shape of the situation, was such that a very large portion of the Mercer operation's human infrastructure arrived in the main street of Red Hollow before sundown. Elias watched Harlan come down the main street. It was impossible not to watch. Harlan rode with his hands bound at the wrist in front of him and his back straight and his chin level, and he looked at nothing and no one specific, his gaze fixed at the neutral middle distance of a man who has decided that what is happening is beneath his dignity and that maintaining that position is the only thing currently available to him. He looked for the first time at Elias's observation of him old, not diminished exactly. The quality of stillness that Elias had registered that morning at the ranch house was still present, but the stillness had changed its nature. It was no longer the stillness of a man who had nothing to prove because he'd already proven everything. It was the stillness of a man holding on to the form of himself because the substance of what had supported that form was gone. Brett was already in the marshal's office when Harlan arrived. Through the window, Elias could see the shape of Brett standing in the back section where the 2 holding cells were, and when the door opened and Harlan was walked in, there was a moment visible from outside. Through glass, when father and son looked at each other. Elias didn't know what was in that look. He'd never know. It was the private interior of a thing that had begun before he arrived in Red Hollow, and would continue long after he left it, in courtrooms, and in whatever remained between these 2 men after the courts finished their work. He looked away. Calder found him as the light was beginning to go, standing at the south end of the main street where the road out of Red Hollow started to straighten and head for the next town. The inspector walked up beside him and stood there for a moment, looking at the same road. The case is solid, Calder said. The ledger alone covers 14 separate counts of fraudulent brand registration. The correspondence adds conspiracy charges involving 2 county officials who are going to have a very unpleasant winter. He paused. The ranchers who were defrauded there are 11 families we've identified so far. Probably more once the records are fully reviewed. Will they see anything back? Elias said. Some. The property seizures will generate funds that get distributed through the territory's restitution process. It's slow and it's never quite enough and it doesn't give back the years. Calder said this without apology or softening just the plain accounting of what justice cost when it arrived late. But it's something. It's more than they had yesterday. Elias nodded. Your man Pike, Calder said. He's not my man. The marshal, Calder said, acknowledging the correction with a slight tilt of his head. He's going to face an inquiry. The financial arrangement with the Mercers is documented in the correspondence. He can't walk away from that. A pause. His cooperation today is on the record. His securing of the ranch property alone, without backup, is on the record. Those things will be weighed. Calder looked at Elias sidelong. You took a risk on him. I took a calculated risk, Elias said. There's a difference. Most of the time, Calder said dryly. What would you have done if he'd gone to Harlan instead of riding out to the property? I'd have had to move faster with less, Elias said. It would have been worse. But you'd have had something. I'd have had something, Elias agreed. Calder looked at the road for another moment. You've done this kind of work before. Some. I've seen files from 3 other cases in the territory with your name attached. The New Mexico situation. A ranch dispute up in Montana 2 years ago. A water rights case in Colorado before that. Inspector's voice was neutral, neither approving nor critical. You're not affiliated with any official body. No. You work on information and then hand it off. That's the shape of it, Elias said. And then you leave, Calder said. Elias said nothing, because that was also the shape of it and didn't require confirmation. Calder reached into his coat and produced a card, a plain card with the circuit office's address, and a name printed on it and held it out. If you find something else worth finding, he said, send it here first. Save everyone some time. Elias took the card. I'll consider it. Calder walked back toward the marshal's office, and Elias stood at the south end of the main street, watching the last of the October light go out of the sky in the specific way it went, not gradually, but in stages, each one distinct, each one final. He found Walt Pierce at the livery stable as the evening settled in, which was where Walt was most evenings, and Walt's cousin Abel was there too, not in the stable proper, but sitting on the fence of the paddock outside it, in the cold, which was the kind of sitting that meant a man was working something through and needed air around him to do it. Elias leaned on the fence beside him. Abel Pierce was 32 and looked 40, the way people who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time could look 40 at 32. He had Walt's quietness, but a different quality. Underneath it, Walt's quietness was adaptive, the kind that had developed as a response to what happened. Abel's quietness was older than that, the kind that was already his nature before the Mercer situation had piled itself on top of it. Walt told me about the complaint, Abel said. He didn't look at Elias. He looked at the paddock, at the horses moving in the last of the light. That it's in the federal record now, it is, Elias said. It's part of the documented pattern. Your account of what you saw at the feeding station, the brands, the numbers, the dates it corroborates, the ledger entries. It helps establish the timeline. Abel was quiet for a moment. I used my real name on that letter, he said. I was 22. I thought that mattered, that it would make someone take it seriously. His jaw moved. They fired Walt because of me, because I signed my real name. Walt doesn't hold that against you, Elias said. I know he doesn't. Abel's voice had a flat edge to it that was not directed at anyone present. That's worse, actually. He doesn't hold it against me and I lost him his job. Sly said nothing for a moment. There was nothing useful to say to that specific kind of grief, the kind that you carry, about the damage your right actions did to people you love. It didn't need to be argued with or fixed. It needed to be acknowledged and then left where it sat. What you wrote down 2 years ago, Elias said finally, is what made the pattern visible. Without the dates you recorded, the ledger entries are harder to sequence. Without the brand marks you identified, there are 3 entries Calder couldn't have connected to specific ranchers. He paused. You did a real thing when you did that. It cost you more than it should have. Both of those are true at the same time. Abel looked at the horses. The rancher my cousin told you about, Abel said. The one who moved to Casper with his family. I remember, Elias said. His name is Ferris. Emmett's. He had good land. Good water. Abel shook his head slowly. He had 4 kids under 10 and a wife who'd built a kitchen garden. It took her 3 years to get right. I know, Elias said. There are 11 families identified so far. Calder said it could be more. Does Ferris know, Abel said. Does he know that it's... Not yet, Elias said. That notification goes through the circuit office. It'll reach him. He paused. It'll take time. It took 2 years to get this far, Abel said. and there was no bitterness in it. Just the arithmetic of it, which was its own kind of heavy. I guess I can wait a little longer to know if any of it mattered. It mattered, Elias said. The waiting doesn't change that. Abel looked at him finally directly, for the first time in the conversation, with the assessing look of a man who had been lied to by the official systems of his world enough times to know what a lie felt like when it wore the costume of reassurance and was checking whether this was one. Apparently it wasn't. He nodded once and went back to looking at the horses, and Elias stayed on the fence beside him for a few more minutes in the cold evening air before leaving him to it. The powder horn was doing quiet business when Elias went in that evening. Not empty, there were 7 or 8 men distributed around it, but subdued in the particular way of a room processing something. Callum was behind the bar with the same competence as always, but his posture was different, less the compressed readiness of a man managing an environment that required constant management, and more the ordinary ease of someone who'd put down a weight they'd been holding for a while, and was noticing how different the air felt without it. He set down a cup of coffee in front of Elias without being asked. "Heard you were out at the Mercer property this morning," Callum said. "Among other places," Elias said. "Also heard you were deputized. Temporarily." Callum was quiet for a moment, wiping the same section of bar he'd wiped in the same motion in their first conversation, the gesture apparently being how he organized his thinking. 6 years, he said, thereabouts. 6 years if he stopped. Started differently. I served drinks to Brett Mercer twice a week for 6 years. I watched him do what he did in here. Watched it and poured the next round. He set down the cloth. I don't know what that makes me. It makes you someone who survived, Elias said. That's what most people in Red Hollow are. That's not a moral failure. It's a condition. Easy thing to say, Callum said. I know, Elias said. Doesn't make it wrong. Callum looked at him for a moment, then went back to the bar. Elias drank his coffee and sat in the quiet of the room and thought about what Nolan had said to him on the main street to make sure what just happened is actually what it looks like. He thought about what that meant, which was not about the physical facts of the day. Those were clear enough, but about whether the thing those facts added up to was real and permanent, or whether it was the kind of apparent resolution that looked like an ending from inside it, and turned out from a distance to be just a pause. He didn't know. He'd learned in the years of this kind of work that he couldn't know. You built what you could build from the materials available. You handed it to the people who were equipped to carry it forward, and then you stopped being the one responsible for it, which was the hardest part. Not because responsibility was comfortable, but because laying it down required trusting that what you'd built was real enough to hold on its own. He thought it would hold. He wasn't certain. Certainty was not a thing this kind of work produced. He finished his coffee and put a coin on the bar and walked out into the cold Red Hollow night. And the night was quiet in the way that it hadn't been quiet since he'd arrived, not the suspended, held breath quiet of a town under pressure, but something closer to ordinary silence, the kind that happened between things rather than before them. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment, looking at the main street, the marshal's office with its lamp burning, the general store dark, the boarding house at the far end with Mrs. Tatum's kitchen light visible through the side window, steady and plain. Tomorrow, Calder would begin the formal process of what came next. The circuit court, the documentation, the slow machinery of consequence being applied to the people who had constructed 6 years of damage and had believed, right up until this week, that it was permanent. It was not Elias's part of it. What came tomorrow? His part was done. He went back to the boarding house and slept without dreaming, which was the most he ever asked of a night after this kind of day. He was up before sunrise on the 7th day, which was a Thursday, and the first thing he did was the same thing he'd done every morning. Since arriving in Red Hollow, he stood at the window of his room and looked at the main street below and took stock of what the town was doing. What the town was doing at 5 in the morning on this particular Thursday was sleeping. Genuinely sleeping, not the held breath suspension of the previous mornings. The street was empty in the uncomplicated way that streets are empty when nothing is about to happen, when the quiet is the thing itself rather than the space before something else. Elias stood at the window for a few minutes and registered this, and then he got dressed and began to pack. He didn't have much. The work of a man who moves between places tends to compress itself over time into the truly necessary, and Elias had been compressing for years. A change of clothes, a shaving kit, the document case that was considerably lighter now than when he'd arrived, most of its contents having transferred to Calder's custody the previous afternoon, a worn copy of survey maps for this part of the territory that he'd been carrying for 6 weeks and which had served their purpose. He packed slowly, not because he was reluctant, but because slow packing was honest packing. You found out what you actually needed versus what you'd been carrying out of habit. He left the room tidy bed made with the corners squared the way Mrs. Tatum kept her house, which seemed like the minimum courtesy, and carried his bag downstairs. Mrs. Tatum was already in the kitchen. The coffee was already made. She looked at the bag and said nothing, which was her way of saying everything she intended to say about his departure. He ate breakfast standing again the way he'd eaten his first breakfast in this house, and she stood near the stove and occupied herself with the morning's preparations, and periodically refilled his cups at the silent efficiency that had characterized every interaction between them for a week. When he set his cup down for the last time, she turned and looked at him directly. The stage office confirmed the envelope was received, she said, yesterday before the stage left. Thank you, Elias said, for that and for the rest of it. She looked at him with the clear, undeceived eyes of a woman who had seen a considerable amount of human behavior across 30 years of running a boarding house and had developed from that experience an accurate measure of people. You're not going to wait to see how it turns out, she said. I know how it turns out, he said. The rest is Calder's work. And the people here, she said. The ones who helped you. Nolan. Walt. They'll be all right, he said. Better than before, anyway. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, The gray mare needs water before you go. I told the livery boy to have her ready at 6. It was 10 minutes to 6. I know, she said before he could respond. She turned back to the stove. He picked up his bag. Walt was at the livery stable, which was not surprising, and the gray mare was watered and saddled with the efficiency of someone who'd learned horses before he learned most other things. Walt watched Elias check the cinch in the saddlebags with the expression of a man who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. Nolan's going to want to know why you didn't say goodbye, Walt said finally. I'm saying it now, Elias said. Tell him he's at the store. It's not open yet, but he goes in early. Walt paused. You could walk over. Elias tightened the cinch strap and considered this. I'll walk over, he said. The general store was dark from the outside, but the side door was unlocked, and Nolan's was inside in the back section, organizing a delivery of dry goods with the focused, methodical attention of someone who finds comfort in tasks with visible outcomes. He looked up when Elias came in, and something in his face adjusted, not surprise exactly. More the expression of someone whose anticipation has just been confirmed. You're leaving, Nolan said, this morning. Nolan set down the crate he'd been moving and leaned against the shelving behind him. He looked older than when Elias had first spoken to him across this counter a week ago, but not in the way that bad things make people older. More the way that things that have been resolved make people older, the weight of the unfinished sitting heavier than the weight of the done, and the done finally being carried, showing in the face. Calder's men will want to talk to you again, Elias said. Probably more than once. You should be prepared for that. I know. Your testimony matters. The conversations we had, the things you observed, Calder can use those to corroborate the documentary record. You don't have to offer more than what you actually saw and heard. That's enough. Nolan nodded. What about Finch? It was a question Elias hadn't expected, and the fact that Nolan was asking it told him something worth knowing. What about him? He gave me work when no one else would. He never said why. Nolan looked at the crates. He never asked me to do anything wrong. Never leaned on me for the Mercers. He just kept running his store and keeping his head down. He met Elias's eyes. Is he going to be caught in this somehow? Because he didn't report what he knew. Elias thought about it honestly. Calder's focus is on the people who participated and profited. Finch didn't do either. Keeping your head down when the cost of raising it is everything you have, that's not a crime. It's a condition, he paused. He'll be fine. Nolan exhaled. It was a small sound, but it carried the specific relief of someone who'd been holding a concern for longer than the conversation that just resolved it. You could stay, Nolan said. He said it plainly, without pressure, the way you say things you mean, but don't expect to change anything. There's going to be a period where this town is trying to figure out what it is now. You understand it better than most people here do. I understand what it was, Elias said. What it is now is up to the people who live in it. That's not me. Nolan looked at him steadily. Is there a place where that is you? A place you stay? It was a different kind of question than any Nolan had asked him before. More personal. More direct. The question of someone who'd spent a week watching a man operate and had come to a conclusion about what the operating cost. Elias thought about answering it honestly and decided that honesty was owed. Not yet, he said. Maybe not ever. I haven't figured out how to stop seeing the next thing yet. Nolan nodded slowly. That's either a gift or a problem. It's both, Elias said. Same thing sometimes. He held out his hand. Nolan shook it, a firm, brief handshake. The kind between people who have been through something real together and don't need it theatricalized. Take care of your cousin, Elias said. I always do, Nolan said. He just doesn't always make it easy. Elias almost smiled at that. They never do, he said, and walked back out through the side door into the cold morning. He was in the saddle by 6:15, the gray mare moving at her usual pace, walked down the main street of Red Hollow in the early light. The The street was just beginning to show its first activity, a lamp lit in the window of the powder horn, where Callum was probably doing his morning preparation. A figure moving near the feed store, smoke starting from the chimney of the laundry where Bessie Greer began her days early. He rode the length of the main street without stopping. Near the south end, where the road began to straighten out of town, he passed the marshal's office. The lamp was lit inside. Through the window he could see the shape of Warren Pike at the desk, working or doing the thing that looked like working, which was sometimes all that was available to a man with too much to think about, and not enough clarity yet to know how to think about it. Elias didn't stop there either. Pike's accounting was ahead of him in the circuit court, and whatever that accounting produced was what it produced. The man had made choices that were wrong, and then, at the moment when it genuinely mattered, had made a choice that wasn't. Both of those things were in the record. Calder would weigh them. The court would weigh them. What Elias thought about it didn't add anything to that process. He rode past the marshal's office and out of Red Hollow into the open country. The road south was flat for the first few miles, running through the valley floor with the creek visible to the east, and the hills rising gradually on both sides. The morning was sharp and clear, the kind of October morning that apologized for nothing, and offered nothing but its own cold precision. Elias rode without urgency, letting the mare set her own pace, and thought about what Nolan had asked him. Is there a place where that is you? He'd given the honest answer, which was that he didn't know. He'd been doing this work not officially, not affiliated, just following the pattern of what needed following for 7 years since leaving the Cattlemen's Association. 7 years of arriving in places, learning what was wrong with them, building what could be built from the available materials, and handing it to whoever was positioned to carry it from there. 7 years of not staying. He was not romantic about it. It was not, in his own assessment, an especially admirable life. It was a functional one, he was suited to it, and it needed doing, and those two facts had aligned in a way that kept him on the road. But Nolan's question had a hook in it that didn't come out cleanly on the ride south, because what it pointed at was something Elias had been aware of for a while, and had not found a way to resolve, that skizzle of seeing the next thing was real and useful, and that it had, over 7 years, become so habitual that he was no longer certain he could stop doing it, even if he found a place worth stopping for. That was worth thinking about. He put it in the same interior space where he put things that were worth thinking about, and had no immediate resolution, and let the mare carry him south. He was 4 miles from Red Hollow, the town no longer visible behind him, when he heard hooves behind him on the road. He didn't tense. The sound was single horse, unhurried, and unhurried single horses on open roads were not threats. He turned in the saddle and looked. Abel Pierce was riding toward him on a brown gelding that had clearly been saddled in a hurry, the saddle sitting slightly crooked, the way it sits when you're moving fast and not paying attention to the details of tack. Abel rode up alongside and pulled his horse to a walk that matched the mare's pace, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Walt told me you were leaving, Abel said. I figured you'd take the south road. I did, Elias said. Abel rode beside him in silence for another 100 yards. I wanted to ask you something before you were gone and I couldn't. Ask it, the ranchers who were defrauded, Abel said. The 11 families Calder identified. Are they going to know, will they understand exactly what happened? Not just that there was fraud, but what it cost them. He paused. Because I keep thinking about Ferris, about his wife's kitchen garden, about the fact that she built that garden over 3 years and then had to leave it, and she probably doesn't know why she had to leave it. Not really. He looked at the road ahead. Does the legal process, does it explain things, or does it just move money? Elias considered this. Both, he said. The process explains what happened in legal language, which is accurate but not always the same as explaining it in human language. Calder will present the findings to the court. The court record will be public. The families will be notified of their eligibility for restitution. He paused. Whether someone explains it to them the way you're describing, that depends on who's around them. That's not something the circuit court does. Abel was quiet for a moment. Somebody should, he said. Somebody should, Elias agreed. I'm going to write to Ferris, Abel said. He said it with the decisiveness of someone who has just resolved something that has been sitting unresolved and found the resolution simpler than he expected. Not about the legal part. Just I'm going to tell him what I saw, what I wrote down, what happened to the letter. He glanced at Elias. Is that all right legally? The case is filed, Elias said. Your testimony is in the record. Writing a personal letter to a man you knew explaining what you observed 2 years ago is not something anyone can object to, Abel said. They rode in silence for a little while. The hills on the east side of the road were catching the first real angle of morning light, which turned the scrub and the pale grass a color that was almost amber. My cousin almost got hurt yesterday, Abel said. Standing in front of that store while Brett had him. I know, Elias said. That was my mistake. I should have anticipated that Brett would move on the people around me rather than on me directly. Abel looked at him. Nolan doesn't blame you, I know that too. Doesn't change the calculation. Abel seemed to turn this over. You hold yourself responsible for things that are in the range of what you could have controlled, he said slowly. But you don't seem to hold yourself responsible for things that weren't. That's the aim, Elias said. I don't always get there. Most people get it exactly backwards, Abel said. They blame themselves for things they couldn't have changed and let themselves off the hook for things they could. Elias looked at him sidelong. You've been thinking about that for a while. 2 years, Abel said. There was no bitterness in it anymore. Just the honest accounting. I spent a year blaming myself for signing that letter. For what it cost Walt. Then I spent a year trying to figure out whose fault it actually was. He paused. Turned out that was easier to determine than I expected. Usually is, Elias said. Once you're ready to look at it. They reached a fork in the road, the south fork continuing flat toward the next town, the east fork curving up through the hills toward the ranching country where Abel's connections were. Abel pulled his horse to a stop. I'm going to go back, he said. I've got work, I know, Elias said. Abel looked at him with the direct, unguarded look that he'd had on the fence outside the livery stable, the night before, the look of a man who'd done most of his growing up in private, and was still getting used to doing some of it in front of another person. What you did, Abel said. It wasn't nothing. I want you to know that somebody said it out loud. Elias held his gaze. I know, he said, thank you. Abel nodded. Turned his horse east, rode up into the hills without looking back. Elias sat at the fork for a moment, watching him go. Then he turned the gray mare south and let her walk. The truth about work like his, and he had turned this over enough times to have arrived at something he believed was actually true, rather than something that was just comfortable, was that it didn't feel the way it looked from outside. From outside, what had happened in Red Hollow looked like one man dismantling a corrupt operation through cleverness and nerve. That was the shape of the story if you stood far enough back to see only the shape. From inside it, what it had felt like was a series of small decisions made with incomplete information and real uncertainty, several of which had almost failed, and one of which, leaving Nolan exposed to Brett's attention while he rode to the line camp, had produced a risk he should have anticipated and hadn't. It had worked in the end because enough of the pieces had held, and because the people involved, Walt, Nolan, Abel, Decker Pike, at the last possible moment, Aubrey on the northeast road, had each made a choice when a choice was in front of them. That was the part that didn't make it into the story from outside. The story from outside was a drifter who got slapped and took down an empire. The actual story was a drifter who got slapped and then found 12 other people who were already carrying what needed to be carried and who had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to tell them what to carry it toward. He had not dismantled the Mercer operation. He had organized the dismantling of it by the people who had been living inside its damage for years. That was a meaningful distinction, not because it was modest, but because it was accurate. And accuracy mattered more than the cleaner version. The cleaner version gave all the credit to the man who arrived from outside. The accurate version gave most of the credit to Nolan, standing with his back against the general store wall for an hour, while Brett Mercer tried to intimidate a different outcome, to Abel writing a letter with his real name on it 2 years ago, which had been the right thing to do, and had cost him, and had turned out to matter. To Decker, standing in the street behind the general store at 11 at night, saying he was tired of the sound of telling himself it wasn't his problem. Those were the moments the thing actually turned on. Elias had constructed the framework. They had filled it. He rode south and thought about this for a long time. Not because it required resolution, it didn't. It was already as resolved as it was going to get, but because thinking about it clearly was a way of holding it honestly, of not letting the distance from it convert it into a story cleaner than the reality had been. By mid-morning, Red Hollow was half a day's ride behind him, and the country was opening out into the longer distances of the southern valley. The landscape growing wider and quieter around him, in the way of open country that hasn't been settled yet and may never be. The gray mare had found her road pace, the steady, rhythmic walk she settled into when she understood they were covering ground rather than arriving anywhere in particular, and Elias rode with his weight easy in the saddle and his mind moving through what was ahead of him with the same quiet attention he'd brought to Red Hollow 7 days ago. He knew where he was going. There was a situation 2 territories over that he'd been tracking for 3 months, building from a small piece of information that had come to him from a retired land agent who'd seen something in the county records that didn't add up and had mentioned it to the wrong person, and then, for reasons Elias had not yet fully understood, had mentioned it to him. Water rights this time, not cattle. Different mechanism, same basic architecture, a powerful interest, accumulated over years, gradually making it impossible for smaller interests to survive without selling. The same slow pressure applied below the threshold of what anyone could act on individually, visible only from far enough back to see the pattern. He was not unaware of the repetition. 7 years of this, and the repetition, was the thing that sometimes in the honest hours of the early morning, he looked at directly and asked himself what it meant, whether the work was genuinely useful or whether it was a way of moving forward without arriving anywhere, whether there was a version of his life in which he stayed somewhere long enough to see what staying felt like. He didn't know. That was the honest answer. He'd given it to Nolan, and he'd given it to himself, and it hadn't changed. What he knew was that the Ferris family in Casper, in a room above a feed store, was going to receive notification from the circuit court in the coming weeks that they were eligible for restitution from the Mercer estate seizure. That the kitchen garden Ferris's wife had built over 3 years and left behind was not coming back, and the years of reduced circumstances were not coming back, and those were real losses that a legal proceeding could acknowledge but couldn't undo, and that Abel Pierce was going to write a letter to Emmett Ferris, not a legal letter, not an official notification. Just one man writing to another to say, here is what I saw, and here is what I did, and here is what it turned out to mean, and that letter was going to matter in ways that were not measurable by any process Calder's circuit court had a category for. That was the human part of it, the part that lived outside the ledger entries and the documented counts and the restitution schedule, the part that was about one person saying to another, you were not wrong about what happened to you. Someone saw it. Someone wrote it down. Elias thought that was probably the most important part. He was not sure he'd ever found a clean way to articulate why, and he'd stopped trying. Some things were true in the way that solid ground was true, not because you could explain them, but because you could stand on them. He was 2 hours south of Red Hollow when he passed a small ranch set back from the road, a modest operation with a solid fence line, and a house that had been added to over several years, in the way of people who are building something they intend to keep. A woman was in the yard, hanging washing on a line strung between 2 posts, working with the efficient, unsentimental motion of someone doing necessary work in cold air. She didn't look up as he rode past. He didn't stop. But he thought about the kitchen garden, about Ferris's wife in Casper, about what it meant to build something over 3 years and have it taken from you not by weather or by the reasonable losses of life, but by another person's deliberate calculation, a calculation that had been protected by money and influence and the willingness of people who should have known better to look away. He thought about how ordinary that was, how it happened in 100 valleys in this territory, in 100 versions of Red Hollow, with 100 versions of the same architecture of accumulated power and practiced indifference. He thought about the fact that the situations that got addressed were the ones where someone happened to be paying attention, and the ones that didn't get addressed were not less real. That was the part that kept him on the road. Not the moments after, not the watching of the pieces fall, not the satisfaction of a ledger recovered, or a corrupt official arrested, or a crowd finally watching what they'd been forbidden to watch. Those moments were real, and they were something, but they weren't the engine of it. The engine was the before. The 12 people in the next valley who were already carrying what needed to be carried, and who didn't yet know what to carry it toward. He did not consider himself a particularly good man. That was not false modesty. It was the assessment of someone who had examined himself with reasonable honesty and found a mixed record. He was better at seeing the problem than at living with the absence of one. He was better at the work than at the rest. He had made mistakes in Red Hollow that he would carry as information about his own limits. He would not be, the cleaner version of himself that the story from outside required. But he was paying attention. And in a world where the cost of not paying attention was borne entirely by the people who were already most burdened, paying attention was not nothing. The gray mare walked south into the widening country, and Elias Rourke rode with his weight easy and his mind already moving toward the next valley, carrying what he'd learned in Red Hollow the way he carried all of it, not lightly, not heavily, but honestly, which was the only way it was worth carrying at all. Behind him, Red Hollow was beginning the long work of figuring out what it was now that the thing holding it in place was gone. That work would be imperfect and slow, and would produce over time something that was better than before, without being anything close to perfect. The people who did it would not all agree on how to do it. Some of them would fail. Some of them would surprise themselves. Nolan would stack shelves for a while and then eventually do something else. Walt would keep working horses because he was good at it and because it was honest. Abel would write his letter to Ferris, and that letter would arrive in a room above a feed store in Casper, and would be read by a man sitting at a table while his 4 children moved around him, and something would shift in that room not dramatically, not completely, but in the specific way that truth shifts things when it finally arrives. Warren Pike would face his accounting, and it would be what it would be. And 3 days it had been only 3 days from the slap on the boardwalk to the moment Calder put the ledger in his saddlebag. Though it felt, from inside it, like something that had taken much longer, 3 days had been enough to change the permanent-seeming thing that had been settled over Red Hollow for 6 years. That was the thing about power that was built on fear and silence. It required constant maintenance. It required everyone, every day, to continue making the choice to look away. And it only needed one person to stop making that choice for the whole maintenance to become visible as the artificial construction it had always been. Brett Mercer had slapped a stranger on a public boardwalk because he had never once been shown the outside of his own certainty. He had no way of knowing that the stranger had already been looking for something worth finding, that the slap had not started anything, it had simply made visible what was already in motion, given it a face and a starting point, and a red mark on a cheek that faded over 7 days into nothing. Elias Rourke rode south. His cheek had healed completely. He was already thinking about the water rights case 2 territories over, about the land agent's letter in his coat pocket, about the pattern he'd been assembling for 3 months from the outside, and needed now to see from the inside. He was already paying attention. That, in the end, was all it had ever taken. And it was never as simple as it sounded. And it was never enough on its own. And it always required the 12 other people who were already there, already carrying the weight, already waiting without knowing they were waiting for someone to arrive and say, "I see what you see. I believe what you know. Let's build something from it." The mare found her pace on the long, flat road. Red Hollow disappeared behind the first low rise. The country opened ahead, wide and cold and full of the next thing.